All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you happen to be in the world currently joining us. This is Adding Style with CSS Jumpstart. I am Christopher Harrison, and I'm joined today by Helen Zhang. In the meantime, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to talk about. So we've got 6 modules today, and module 1 is sort of the ubiquitous getting started with CSS, where we want to talk about what CSS is, the basics of how to apply it, how to bring in external style sheets, and so forth. And then that'll lead us very naturally into module 2, where we're going to take a look at how to identify individual elements or individual blocks of elements. So what do you say we actually get started?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at CSS. There's the camera that I want. Let's take a look at CSS, and now he takes it away, and talk about exactly what CSS is all about here. So we're going to start off with kind of what CSS, why you want to use CSS, what's important about it. And then we'll roll on into element selection. We'll actually spend a lot of time today, both in this module and in the next module, talking about how to identify individual elements, how to identify types of elements, how to identify elements based on their state, where they happen to be, and so forth. So that way I can say, hey, this is how I want you to display, this is where I want you to display, maybe I don't want you to display, things like that. So we'll go in and take a look at all of that. We'll take a look at the different ways that we can actually apply CSS to a page, and that will actually lead us perfectly into CSS inheritance. Now, chances are you've checked out another MVA, and one of the things that you've probably picked up about MVA in general is that MVAs do tend to be demo heavy. Today's not going to be an exception to that. We are going to have an awful lot of demos because you're a developer, right?
Yes.
And I'm a developer, and you're all developers. And one of the big things about being developers, we need to see it.
Yeah.
You know, you need to actually see how it works. So there is going to be a lot of demos. The one little catch that we're going to have a bit this morning is there's a little bit of groundwork that we need to lay out first before we can get to a demo. So if you're sitting there and you're watching and you're going, hey, can we see a demo? Trust me. There's going to be plenty of demos. We'll get there. It's just going to take a couple of minutes to kind of roll through a little bit of background stuff first. So, cool. Well, let's get in and take a look then at what CSS is all about. So CSS, of course, stands for Cascading Style Sheets. All right. Well, the cascading part we'll talk about in a few minutes. Let's focus in on the style sheet part for right now. The style sheet part is, this is a language that we can use now to lay out whatever it is that we might want. And of course, the most natural coupling is with HTML. Now, you might be wondering, all right, well, wait a minute, Christopher. I could actually fire up HTML, and I could actually just say something like this, that maybe, actually, apparently I'm going to do it this way because I don't have Zoom started yet, but that's okay. So maybe I could go in and I could say bold, and I could say hello, like that, and I could close off my bold tag like that. Well, that's style, right?
Yeah, I mean, it'll make the hello bold.
It'll make the hello bold, but is that a really good way to do things?
Not if you want to, for instance, repeat this, or, you know, apply to a couple of different elements.
Absolutely.
Or if you want to change it even.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because what we've now said is that hello has to be bold. That's it. And so the first big problem is, what happens if you want to change that? Or what happens if you want to be able to change that based on the device? So maybe I want that to be bold on a mobile phone, but I don't want that to be bold on a desktop. Or maybe I don't want that to be bold when it's printed out. Well, I've said this is going to be bold. That's it, period. End of discussion. There's nothing else that that's going to be but bold. The other big problem that I have is, have I told you anything else about this little hello? Do you know anything else about that hello?
Nothing.
Nothing. You know that it's going to be bold, and that's it.
Yeah.
Is that a title? Is that a greeting? Is that a header for an article?
Yeah, I kind of think it's important, but even that, I mean, I'm not sure.
Exactly. And that's the problem. So you don't know if it's important or not. I don't know if it's important or not. The browser isn't going to know if it's important. A screen reader isn't going to know it's important. And a search engine isn't going to know it's important. That obviously a lot of time is spent on SEO, search engine optimization, and SEO is extremely important. And one of the things that I always try to highlight is if you're doing good things, that's going to naturally start to move your page up. You know, a lot of people spend time focused in on performance, and performance is important. But really, if you write good code first, you're going to find more often than not that the good code is the best performant code. So if you just focus in on, hey, how can we make this code work really, really well, read really well, that's generally speaking automatically going to be the fastest way to write it. Same exact thing when you're talking about search engine optimization, is that if you design your pages well, they're typically going to be optimized in search engines. Why? Because the search engine is going to understand what that page is about. So if I can tell a search engine, hey, that's a header, it now has more information that it can operate on, and it has a better understanding of where to put that page in regards to, or in relation to other pages for particular queries. So not only do we want to focus in on this is how we want to display it, but we also want to focus in on exactly what that information is. And that's where that separation of concern comes into play. So rather than just simply saying, hey, we want this to be bold, let's let HTML put together the structure of the document. So let's let HTML tell us this is what the head is. This is what the article is. This is what the section is. This is where our navigation is. Let HTML do things like that. And then let's let something else handle the logic. That's of course going to be JavaScript. And let's let something else handle the formatting and display. And that's where CSS is going to come into play. That nice, clean separation of concern. So rather than going in and having a bold here, maybe we go in and we use a header tag, or maybe we go in and we do an H1 tag. And I understand that H1, of course, is going to give you formatting, but H1 is still going to be understood as that's a header, and we can, of course, take that with style and adjust that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so focus our HTML on describing our data, focus our CSS then on how we want to display that data. And that's why CSS is important. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the basics. Now, the nice part about CSS in general is it is a relatively easy language to understand, I would say. That you're going to notice that it's really broken down into two basic sections. That we've got selectors, and then we're going to have the key value pairs. So our selectors are basically, what do we want to apply this to? And so this could be an individual element, this could be groups of elements, this could be elements of a particular type, this could be elements in different locations, but it's what do we want to apply this to? Then it's going to be what property do we want to set and to what value do we want to set it to? So now that we figured out, oh, okay, this is what we want to focus our attention on, this is what we want to manipulate, the next question then becomes, well, what do we want to manipulate on that? Exactly how do we want to make that look? Do we want to move it somewhere else? Do we want to make it bold? Do we want to change the color? Things like that. So that's the basics of our CSS syntax. And the thing that you're going to notice is that this syntax is going to be true pretty much universally. So regardless of where it is that you happen to be applying this CSS, so if you put it into a section on a page, which we're going to take a look at, if you put it into an external file, it's still always going to be the exact same. The only place where you're not going to have a selector, which we'll see in a couple of minutes, is if we, on an element, happen to say style equals. So we're not going to have a selector there because it's going to be on that particular element. Instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to take our property value pairs and put those into there. Okay. So now let's talk about finding those elements. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to spend a lot of time on element selection. We've got an entire module coming up on element selection. For right now, we're just going to take a look at the basics. And those three basics are finding all items of a particular type, of a class, we'll have to talk about what a class is, And then finally, based on an ID. But let's start off by talking about an element. So an element, sort of as you might guess, is going to apply to the element. And so all we have to do inside of our CSS is simply say whatever the name of that element happens to be. And one very cool thing that you can do in the syntax, and I don't have it on the slide, is you can also actually list multiple elements with commas. So I could say, well, if I want that to apply to all H1 and all H2 tags, then I can just simply H1, comma, H2, comma, H3, and whatever else it is that you might want. So all of our H2 elements in this case would then have 3 different properties set on them. So our font family, our font weight, and our color. Now, I mentioned earlier, we're not going to go through every single property, because not only would that take forever, I think that would be a little bit boring.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are self-explanatory just from looking at it.
Yeah, generally speaking, they are self-explanatory. Now, one of the things though, and I find this sometimes with like font weight and then font decoration, is it's not always as clear as you might hope. Yeah. This is where the IntelliSense in Visual Studio really shines.
Yeah.
That the IntelliSense for CSS is spectacular. So that way, if you're not sure of what you're looking for, just start typing a few characters. Chances are, just like Helen said, because a lot of them are self-explanatory, you'll find the one that you're looking for. So just type a few characters and then go, oh, okay, that's the one that I want, and then let the IntelliSense sort of guide you from there.
Exactly. I think the one that is confusing, though, is color. Color is one of the ones that we have here for the H2 element. Mm-hmm. And color, you might think color should just apply to whatever the element is. If it's like a box, that would apply to the box. But it usually just applies to text.
Exactly. Yep.
And that's the one that I think gets a lot of people in the beginning.
Yeah. So you would think it might be font dash color.
Yeah, exactly. But it's color. If you put the color thing, the color property on body, it'll just apply to all the text in the body. Right. It won't make change the background color, for instance.
Exactly. But there is a background color property.
Exactly. Which we'll get to.
Yep, exactly. I also want to highlight real quickly here on this and kind of use this as a little side teaching, is you'll notice that we've got font family. And one of the cool things that you can do with CSS, and this is a little bit advanced and we're not going to dig too far into it, is you can actually push down your own fonts. So if you have a TrueType font and you want to push that down, you actually have that ability. So fonts are obviously a very big thing. There are a couple little catches about trying to push down your own fonts and things like that. So whenever you are going to be choosing a font, you want to give the browser the ability to fall back to something else. So if it doesn't have a particular font that you might want, give it something that it can fall back to. And that's exactly what font family is going to do here. Is that with font family, what I'm going to do is specify, okay, well, we want to use Verdana. If you don't have Verdana, then let's fall back to some other sans serif font, which is basically going to be just like that. So it's not going to have, so for example, if I had an L, so that would be a serif, so it's got my little feet. Sans serif is just going to have the little L. Yeah. Sort of the simplest way, I think, to describe it.
Yeah, I think serif fonts you can associate with like newspapers or basically print things, and then sans serif is what you normally see sans serif fonts online. They're a bit easier to read on screens.
Yeah, they're a little bit easier digital-wise. Yep. Okay. So element, that's going to apply to every single H2. Now, when it comes to like an H2 tag, that's probably just fine. Because you're probably going to be using those for headers, and you probably want all of your headers to look the same. So H2, just globally say, yes, we want that to work for everything. That's going to be perfect. But how about a div tag? Do you think that you're going to globally be wanting to set things for all div tags or all span tags everywhere?
Yeah, it's a bit too general, right? Because you're going to use those everywhere on your page. Exactly.
So we want to be able to, rather than just simply saying I want all div tags to look a particular way, we want to be able to identify particular types of div tags, because it's going to be based on how we're currently using them. So we might be setting up a navigation section with a div tag. So I might say div, but I want this for my navigation. Or we might be setting up a sidebar, and I'm going to be using a div tag for that. So we want to be able to identify different types of div tag. And that's where class comes into play. that a class is going to give us the ability to identify elements of a particular type, and the way that we're going to identify that type is by adding on a class. So there's going to be two moving parts here. The first moving part is going to be inside of CSS. Now you're going to notice here on the syntax that our syntax is slightly different from what we had before. That previously we just simply said name of the tag. Now what you're going to notice is I've got a little dot there. And my dot indicates that this is going to be a class. So that needs to be inside the CSS. By the way, you are going to notice that a lot of the demos are going to just simply use color, especially early on, just because it's such an easy way to identify when you're trying to do element selectors that, hey, look, this applied, or in the case of inheritance, that this is the one that actually won out. So we'll do a lot with color with some of the early demos. But in any event, so we'll make that red. So that's the first part inside of CSS. The second part is going to be inside of the HTML, and you'll notice right there that we've got class equals title. Now the great advantage to a class here is that classes are reusable. So it's possible that maybe this title is going to be for different sidebars. So I've got a sidebar here, I've got a sidebar over here, I want a title up top, I want a title up top. So I can go in and reuse that in multiple places. And I can flag, hey, this is going to be a title. Let me go erase all of my ink. There we go, perfect. So we've got our CSS, we've got our HTML, and thus the result is going to be hello CSS. Now, the problem with doing something like this is that that might be even still a little bit too vague. That maybe I'm going to be using title in a couple of other places. Well, fortunately, I can say I only want a class to work on a particular tag type. And the way that we do that is just by putting in that little tag name right at the very beginning. So now you're going to notice that I've got div.title. So that's only going to apply to div tags. So inside my HTML example, you'll notice that I've got a span tag here, and I've got a div tag here. So the result, when this is all printed out, is you'll notice that that will apply to my div, but it's not going to apply to my span. So my span is going to be whatever the default color is, but my div tag will actually have our hello div. And that is one of the little annoying parts sometimes about CSS, is if something isn't working the way that you expect it to work, generally speaking, it just doesn't do anything. Or sometimes it'll move something somewhere else, but it doesn't give you an error message. And this sort of goes back to old days, that one of the things the browser is going to try and do is look at what you've given it and try to make a best effort and not give you an error message if it isn't able to figure out exactly what you want. So it's just going to try and give you the best that it possibly can. We will notice a little bit later when you get into like the F12 tools, that the F12 tools are really helpful in trying to track down exactly what's applying where, and maybe try to troubleshoot exactly why a particular style isn't applying or not applying. Okay. Now, the problem with class is the fact that, again, it can be still a little bit too vague. So maybe on a page, there's one little spot that I need to go in and highlight, but only just that one spot. That's it. This is where ID comes into play. ID is only going to work on one specific element, and it's going to be that element with the ID attribute set on it. And that has to be unique. Has to be unique. One little side note here, and I think this is worth mentioning for anybody who's maybe going to be doing manual forms and things like that, is I get a lot of questions about what's the difference between name and ID. And it's a good question. ID is what we can use with JavaScript and with CSS. Name is what's going to be sent back up to the server. Now, if it turns out that you didn't put in a name, then in that case, the ID would be sent up to the server. But if you do have a name, that's what's going to be sent up to the server. So let's say, for example, that again, we've got a form. So I've got my little text box, and on the server, I've got some variable name that I'm going to be expecting. So maybe I'm just expecting that to be, let's say, username.
User.
Yeah. Let's try that again. There we go. USERNAME. I can spell username. See?
Yeah.
Way to go,
good
me.
job.
All right. Yay! Okay. Now, here's the thing: is that's on the server side, and I may not have the ability to go in and change that on the server. So that always has to be username. But I may need to or have a desire to change that on the client side. So that way when I go into my JavaScript and I want to be able to manipulate that and kind of play around with that, I may want to be able to change that and not impact anything on the server. And this is quite common in bigger shops where you've got a web designer and you've got the programmer that's handling the behind the scenes part. So my web designer can sort of do whatever it is that they want, but they're not going to impact the programmer. So they can change the ID, and that's what's going to impact the client. And as long as they keep the name the same, that's still all going to be good. So I always just kind of like to highlight that. Sort of a little bit of a tangent there, but I always like to highlight that because that ID name question always comes up.
Yeah.
So, okay. In any event, the last little thing to mention here is just the syntax. You'll notice pound for an ID. So dot for a class, pound for an ID. Or hash, I guess, for an ID. And I will be the first to admit, I get those backwards quite a bit. I don't know if you do that a lot.
You mean getting the pound sign and the pound sign and the dot?
Exactly. Yeah, that a lot of times I'll say, oh yeah, I want a class, and I'll put a hashtag in front of that.
Yeah, that's usually the first thing I check for when something's not working. I'm just like, I must have selected it wrong.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Now, we've talked an awful lot. I think it's about time to start rolling into a demo. There's one last little thing that we got to talk about, though, and then we can do a demo. I promise. We'll get to a demo. All right. But first, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to apply all of this style. And as it turns out, there's 3 different ways that you can apply a style sheet or style to a page or to an element. The first way, and this generally speaking is the preferred way, is to link to it. So you'll notice that it's a link, relevance equals style sheet, type equals text wax CSS, and then wherever that reference happens to be. Now the nice part about doing that is once again that nice clean separation of concern. So that way my style's over here, my HTML is over here, my JavaScript is over there. So that nice clean separation of concern. So that way when I'm focusing on the HTML, I can focus in on the HTML. And then when I'm focusing on the style, I can focus in on the style. On top of that, this is also going to give you reuse. So that way I can use that on multiple pages. All right. Well, what happens if maybe there is a style, but I only want it on one page? And maybe, or I should do an or there, or maybe you're just looking to go in and play around a little bit. That maybe I don't want to create a full separate CSS file, that maybe I'm just doing a little proof of concept, I'm just doing a little bit of whiteboarding, and I just want to be able to test something and just kind of see how something is going to work real quickly. Well, you'll notice that you can actually just toss style into the head section on a page. And it's going to be that standard CSS syntax that we saw before, where I've got my selector, curly brace, and then the individual values inside of there. So just put that right there into the page. And then finally, last but not least, you can also, if you want, put style directly onto an element. And that's just simply going to have those property value pairs right inside of there. Now, I know some of you are probably already wondering, well, what happens if it turns out that we have something in a style sheet that's external, something inside of a page, and then something on an individual file? You're probably wondering that, and I'm with you. We're going to get to that. See? See? There's your little teaser. I promise we're going to get to that. But first, let's actually get in and start doing a little bit of a demo. I think it's time, don't you?
Yeah. Start to actually see the CSS in action.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Let's see. And I'm going to apologize, and this is going to be my one apology. You are going to notice I'm sort of down a paw here. I really should come up with like a fantastic story involving ninjas or something, but I actually just lost a battle with a wine glass, which is really what happened there. So if you notice my typing is a little slow, there's my apology.
I mean, the tragic gumbo loss, I think, is a good story.
Yeah, that is a good story. I had this fantastic pot of gumbo, cleaning a wine glass over here. Wine glass shatters. And of course, the glass also wound up in the gumbo, so the gumbo was lost. That was tragic. That was tragic. We'll be holding a memorial service later this week for the gumbo. So please send free powder. Okay. In any event, my house was smelling fantastic as well. All right. Let's go in and let's set up a basic web page here. Now, you're going to notice that in all of our demos, we're going to be doing basic HTML here. So we're not going to be doing MVC. We're not going to be doing Flask. We're not going to be doing PHP. We really are focused in on just the CSS. But one big thing to highlight is, of course, you can use CSS with MVC, with Flask, with PHP, with Node. So it's going to apply everywhere. But one of the big things that we wanted to try and do is keep it as simple as possible. And so really just HTML.
Yeah.
So I don't think any of your demos have MVC in them, do
No, they don't even have JavaScript in them because I just want you to know that all the styling, CSS.
Exactly. Just CSS. All CSS all the time. Okay. So in any event, let me go in, web, and let's go in and CSS demos. And I'm just going to highlight mine just to separate them from yours. Christopher Demos. There we go. Perfect. And let's hit OK. And by the way, we are going to be throwing all of these up onto GitHub, and we'll go ahead and share out the little GitHub link a little bit later. But all of these will be available for you to use. Creating projects. Perfect. OK. So let me just go in and say add new item and HTML, and let's go ahead and call this my index page. And let's get rocking and rolling here. All right, now for right now, I'm just going to put the style right inside of here. And the reason that I'm going to do that is just for simplicity's sake, because I'm going to be kind of bouncing back and forth between the style and the HTML. So just to avoid going back and forth from file to file to file, I'm just going to do it inside of here. And then in a couple of minutes, we'll go off and move that somewhere else. So let's just go in and say style, which is spelled like that. Cool. So now let's go in and create a little div tag. And of course, since this is a development class, we're required hello world.
Hello word.
Ah, there we go.
It's also a real thing, hello word.
Yeah.
If you're creating your first Word document.
There you go. Yeah, hello word. Yeah, that would work. All right. And now, Control F5. And I'm just going to use the snap feature here, maybe. Where's my browser? Come here. There we go. OK. And let me also kind of zoom in on that real quick. All right. So I'm just going to use the snap feature here. And Windows 7 was my idea. There we go. So there's our page over here on that side, and there's our HTML. So like we mentioned, the way that style works, if you want an element, all you have to do is to simply say the name of the element, curlies, and then right inside of here, key value pair. So let's just go in and change the font. So I'm going to say font family, and I'm going to use Comic Sans MS here. I would never recommend that you ever actually use Comic Sans MS. But the reason that I'm using it is really just because of the fact that you'll notice it's a very visible change. So
Yeah.
sort of like changing the color, that's very visible. The moment you change something to Comic Sans MS, that's pretty obvious.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that Christopher put the style in the head part of the HTML document. And if you are doing in-page CSS, that is where you should put it.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Okay, so there it is. That's all there is. Just simply name of the element, and away you go from there. But if I wanted to go in and specify a particular, again, type, then what I could do is I could say title, and then, again, curly, and then maybe we go in and we say color, colon, and let's go in and change something to blue. Now, if I save this and I hit refresh, you're going to notice no changes. Because, of course, I don't actually have an element with a class on it. So let's go in and say div, and let's say class equals, I love that bit of IntelliSense. You'll notice that it actually, right there, yeah, title, there we go. And I can now go and say title. I'll just kind of keep it nice and easy, and I'll hit save, and I'm going to hit refresh. Now, when I hit refresh here, you're going to notice, of course, that title appears, that we were expecting, and you'll also notice that it's blue. And that we were also kind of expecting, because, of course, you'll notice that I had class, and I had my little class down here. But what are the other things that you might notice about that text? What font is it using?
Comic Sans.
It's using Comic Sans. Why is that? Well, what is cascading, or I sort of gave away the answer there. What does CSS stand for?
Cascading style sheets.
There you go,
Yeah.
cascading style sheets. So, your styles will cascade. So we said that we want our div tags, all div tags, globally, to use Comic Sans MS. I said that I wanted something with that class to be blue. So what's happening is that it's applying all of those styles together. All right, now give me 1 second here. I just need to fire up my File Explorer here, just because I want zoom it and zoom it. Zoom it. Because it's a great little presentation tool. And I'm going to bring up the F12 tools here. Because I love being able to go in and actually select the items, and we can see this in action here. So let me just kind of zoom that around, and I'm going to click on the little element selection button right there, and then let me click on title. And once I click on title, if I come over here, what you're going to notice inside of our style section is we've got our div tag here, and we've got our title class here. So it's actually showing me every single style that it read to make that happen. So why is it Comic Sans MS? Well, it's Comic Sans MS because we told div tags to be Comic Sans MS. And why is it blue? Well, because of the fact that we said that class title was going to be blue. So that's how all of that's going to come together. Now, you might be wondering at this point, all right, well, now we've seen that if you say, well, I want the font to be this and the color to be this, that it will combine everything. What happens if something said do red, for example, and something else said do blue?
Ooh, conflicts.
Conflicts. All right. Well, fortunately, we've got a full section on conflicts. Let's talk about CSS inheritance and conflicts. And I think the easiest way to describe this is really in 2 very simple steps. Last right wins, and whatever closest describes the item wins.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we're going to break all of that down. But if you keep those 2 things in your head, you'll be just fine in, I think, every case. All right. So, cascading, like we said, it's right there in the name. Conflicts are expected. But conflicts only arise if something says do one thing and something else on that exact same property said do something else. So if it happened to be one thing said do red, another thing did do blue, that's a conflict. In our case, that wasn't a conflict because we said we wanted the font to be something and we said we wanted the color to be something. No conflict there. So those are simply combined. So the question then becomes, all right, well, what about inside of a conflict? Well, step 1, last right wins. And everything is going to be applied in order. So the first thing that's actually going to be applied, and it's reverse on my slide because I was trying to show whatever the most powerful was.
Yeah.
It's reverse on my slide here. It's going to apply first, we'll do it that way, there we go, the external style sheet. Then it's going to apply the style section, and then it's going to apply the style attribute. Or if you like to be kind of a more positive person, then the style attribute takes precedence, and then it's the style section, and then it's the external style sheet. So let's do this. Let's actually get in and do a demo here and kind of see that in action. Perfect. All right, so let me maximize that, and let me sneak on into here, and I'm going to say add, and I want a style sheet. And actually, you know, I'm going to be kind of a good developer here. I'm going to create a brand new folder, and I'm going to say styles, and I'm going to add it into there. Style sheet. Perfect. And let's just call this index, kind of match the name of the page. There we go. All right. And now what I'm going to do inside of here is I'm going to say pound title. So if you remember, we had a class already called title, and see, I told you I was going to do it at some point. Dot title. There we go. Told you I was going to do it. And let's go ahead and say color colon, and let's say red. So just to kind of review here, you're going to notice blue here, red there. So let's kind of see what happens. Let me make sure that I link this, and I love this about Visual Studio. Just simply drag drop.
And it's linked, wow.
Yep, just like that. So it's already got everything. It doesn't put in the type equals, and that's fine. You really don't actually need that.
Yeah, CSS is default.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's bring back up my browser. And what you're going to notice is that sure enough, my title is still blue. Why is it blue? The reason that it's blue is because that was set on the external file. We said on the actual HTML file that we want that to be blue here, so blue is going to win. And you'll also notice that if I go back in and I select that in the F12 tools, I love this about the F12 tools, that we can actually see that, there we go, in action down below. So you'll notice down below, there's our little div, okay, that we were expecting. And right here are the two classes. And I can see where those were applying from. And you'll also notice it does give me little score things as well. And if we want to get really, really technical, there are score things that apply with CSS. But I always think it's just simpler. Last right wins, and whatever best describes the element. Just stick to that, and that's going to make your life a whole lot easier. Yeah. But you'll notice right here, that's crossed out. So we can see the browser saw it. The browser saw that external file. The browser saw, hey, we want the color to be red. But it said, wait a minute, no. Something else wins. And it's going to have that blue win. So you'll notice that the red is all crossed out. Blue wins.
Yeah, and what's nice about the F12 tools is if you deselect, the title color attribute, you can see what would happen.
Yep, exactly. So just like Helen mentioned, let's actually just do that. So let's take away that little title right there, and now you'll notice that it changes to red. So it's a nice way that you can go in and play around with things to kind of see that in action, kind of test to see how things would work. And you'll actually notice there are tools. I want to say the name of the tool is Sidewaffle. I think that's the name of the tool.
I haven't heard of Sidewaffle.
Sidewaffle. So it's a little add-on that you can go get. John Galloway loves Sidewaffle. It's a little add-on that you can go get, and it does an awful lot of like little add-on tools with CSS and things like that. And I want to say that one of the features for Sidewaffle is that it will give you the ability to go in and play around with this and have it automatically update inside Visual Studio. So kind of a slick little tool there. I want to say it's Sidewaffle. I'm gonna check at break. Okay. All right. In the meantime, let's go back in and kind of keep playing around here. So you'll notice again that external, that internal. Let me also do this real quick. I'm going to just say manage NuGet packages. And just because I'm willing to bet that somebody listening is playing around with Bootstrap. And one of the things about Bootstrap is that Bootstrap can be very overwhelming. And because there's, a billion different classes that are inside of there. I don't think I'm exaggerating by that much. But there's like a billion different classes and so forth. And so a lot of people will see Bootstrap and they'll just start to go, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do with all of this. And they get very overwhelmed when they want to go in and play around with the style that Bootstrap is going to provide. Well, here's the thing, is the styling that Bootstrap is using is doing CSS. So all of the same rules apply. So let's say that right here, I dragged out the Bootstrap min CSS, there we go. And down below, I said div class equals, and let's say Jumbotron, and let's say div and hello Bootstrap. There we go. And let's go in and say Bootstrap. Okay, and so you'll notice that we get that little gray background, we get the font and all of that. All of that is coming in from Bootstrap and the Jumbotron class. We can overwrite that. So if I want the text inside of Jumbotron to be blue, for example, fine. Then all I would have to do is just simply say style, and then dot Jumbotron, and then right inside of here, I can just say color colon blue. Let's save that. Let's come back over here, hit refresh, and you'll notice that it's blue. And again, if you want that in an external file, let's just cut that real quick. And I'm just going to put it into my style section. I'm kind of keeping it separate from the other one, style sheet. And I'm going to say Bootstrap demo. There we go. And let's just paste that inside of there. There we go. Save. And let's just do a drag and drop here. And you'll notice I just need to make sure that it's after. Last right wins. So I'm just putting it after the original Bootstrap. There's my custom one. Let's go in, hit save. Let's come back over here, hit refresh. And you'll notice it's still blue. So when it comes to Bootstrap, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we've got an awesome Bootstrap MVA. But when it comes to Bootstrap, Bootstrap can be very overwhelming because of all the different classes. But at the end of the day, what is it?
CSS.
And all the same rules still apply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should also mention that there's another way to overwrite CSS properties, override CSS properties, and it's not recommended.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Go for it.
It's the important property.
Okay.
So for instance, if you have two properties that are in conflict, and one is maybe one is not exactly the last right. If you put in exclamation mark important after the property, it will become more important and overwrite that style. This is not a good practice. You should not use this, but it is one of the ways that you see a lot of people overwriting styles.
I would see that getting very messy very quickly.
Use it sparingly, preferably not at all, but it is there.
Okay, it's worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Now, let's kick on back to slides here. We've got just one last little conflict here that's worth highlighting, and that's in the case of an element. So what happens if maybe we had something that was set for a div tag and for a class, and one was supposed to be red, one was supposed to be blue? What do we do in that case? And the best way to describe this is whatever best describes the element. So if I just say globally, I want all div tags to be something, that's going to apply first. And then if I say I want classes to be, or a particular class to be something, that's going to apply second. And then the ID is going to apply third. Again, last right wins. Or if we want to be kind of the more positive way, what's going to be more important? ID is more important, and then class, and then element. Or if we break this down and actually just, look at it, just do a demo. I like demos. Let's go in and just do a demo. So let me do this. I'm going to just sneak right down here, and I'm just going to say div, and I'm going to say class equals title, and I'm going to say ID equals green. And this is our conflict. Here, we'll make it, conflict with exclamation points. All right. So let's, for right now, just go in and say color colon red, and let me go like this. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. Are you ready for this?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. So our little conflict text here. So you'll notice that right now I've got a div on it, and I've got my class equals title. So you'll notice on div I've got red. You'll notice my class title I've got blue. What color do you think conflict is going to be in?
It would be whatever is closest. So I would say blue.
There you go. And it's going to be blue. So sure enough, our conflict is blue. Now, let's go in and add on our ID as well. I love IntelliSense. There we go. And let's go in and say color, green. And then we'll come back over here. And now if I hit refresh, what you're going to notice is that it's green. So for the element, then for the class, then for the ID, ID is going to win. So whatever best describes the element. Now, the easiest way to handle conflicts, I think, in general, is try to avoid them whenever possible, just because it can get very messy very quickly if you're not careful. And again, if you're ever not sure, the F12 tools do such a great job of showing you exactly what's going on there. And again, you'll notice kind of the scores at the end there. So that had the highest score, which is why that won. But again, I always think it's simpler. Just element, class, ID. Just sort of keep that, and the rest is pretty straightforward from there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I see a lot of people are asking about, is Bootstrap the alternative to CSS? What is the difference between Bootstrap and CSS?
That's a great question. All right. So in a nutshell, Bootstrap is a template. Bootstrap is an out-of-the-box set of JavaScript files and CSS that's going to be designed to help make it easier to lay out a site, because it does a lot of things automatically for you. So for example, let's come back over here to my little Visual Studio, my very simple little index HTML. And you'll notice that with my index HTML, I've got nothing here. There's no automatic banner, there's no automatic button style, there's nothing. Now, I can add all of that if I want to, but I get nothing here. What Bootstrap does, and let me actually just create a brand new MVC project, just because it's got that Bootstrap automatically there, and I think it's going to be kind of an easy way to highlight Bootstrap. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Chugga. And moving your mouse makes it go faster. There we go. Okay, and let me just make sure that that's set as my startup. Set as startup. There we go. Okay, and let me launch this. So what you're going to notice is MVC by default uses Bootstrap. And what Bootstrap is going to do is it's going to give me a lot of different components and a lot of built-in classes that I can use. So once this comes up here, you'll notice this huge block right here in the middle. That's the Jumbotron class. And so that's what's making that gray, that's what's making that a bigger font. You'll notice that the button here has little rounded corners on it, it's got that blue background, and again, that's because of yet another class inside of Bootstrap. And you'll actually notice, if I do this, content and Bootstrap CSS, here is all of the different classes that have been defined inside of Bootstrap and all of the different defaults that it's going to set on all of the different elements inside of there. So Bootstrap isn't a replacement for CSS. Bootstrap uses CSS. Bootstrap is an out-of-the-box set of CSS classes and defaults and otherwise that you can use. And what's also nice about Bootstrap is the fact that it is, it's an open standard. I think it's the best way to put it. It was put out there by Twitter. And so there's a great community around Bootstrap. And you can find all sorts of different Bootstrap themes out there. So you can just drag and drop that onto your project and poof, it will automatically look like that theme. Now, at that point, the next question might become, well, wait a minute. If Bootstrap is going to do all of this for me, why am I going to stop and learn CSS? Well, because if you want to tweak something, you're still going to need to know CSS. So using Bootstrap doesn't take away the need to know CSS. It makes a lot of things easier, but you are still going to need to know CSS. So that way, if you want to go in and tweak one little thing, that you know how to do that. I think that's sort of the best way that I could describe Bootstrap versus CSS.
Exactly. I mean, Bootstrap at the end of the day, all the styling is done by CSS, or I should say most of the styling is done by CSS.
Yep.
But I mean, it'll do the heavy lifting for you, but any tweaks you want to make, you'll still have to do that using CSS.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Cool. Well, with that, what do you say we take a break?
Yeah.
All right.
We'll see you back here soon, in a couple minutes.
About 10 minutes. So we'll see you guys then. All right. In any event, let's go ahead and start digging in and taking a look at our different selectors here. So we're going to start off talking about the different ways that we can find items based on their structure. We'll then roll on into these things called pseudo classes and pseudo elements, which allow us to find items based on their type, or rather based on what's happening, what they're doing. And then we'll close it all off with a little section on sizing, and in particular focused in on font sizing rather than maybe sizing boxes and things like that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But first, let's start talking about our document structure. And I'm actually going to sort of sidestep for a little bit. I'm going to go slightly off center here. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at my little sample page here that I've created, and it's very ugly right now, and that's sort of by design, because what I want to do is gussy this up a little bit over the next handful of demos and kind of make this look the way that we want it to look. And by the way, if you're curious, there's a great little website, Bacon Ipsum, that's a lorem ipsum generator that uses all sorts of different meat products. You've got all of that there. There's all sorts of other ones out there. There's like a hipster Ipsum. There's a vegetarian Ipsum. So there's all sorts of different Ipsum generators that are out there. This is just the one that I went with. But in any event, very, very, ugly. You'll notice that there is no formatting here, really, with the exception of my my little list up at the top here. And I would also mention, just kind of go in and highlight the HTML here, that what I did was I used HTML5. And for those of you not familiar with HTML5, HTML5, among other things, introduces a lot of semantic tags, where rather than saying this is how I want it to display, because that's the job of CSS, what we're going to do is describe the data that's contained inside of it. So that's our nav section, that's our navigation section. And there's an article, and then inside of my article, I've got two different sections inside of my article. And I really like the collapsible regions here. Kind of makes it a little bit easier to see. So we've got our nav section up top, we've got our article, we've got our article. Okay, now I am going to, and again, I'm doing this for simplicity's sake. And I don't want you to look at this and think, oh, well, he's sort of doing a do as I say, not as I do type thing, because I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to make my demos go a little bit easier. So you are going to notice that I'm not going to create a separate style file here. Should I? 100%. And if I was doing this in production, I would 100% have a separate file for this. But because of the fact that I want the ability to show the HTML and the style very easily, I want the ability to bounce back and forth between the style section and that HTML and be able to make those quick little changes, it's going to be easier for demos if I just put the style here. So don't hate me because I'm putting the style inside the HTML page. I know this is not best practice. This is just going to make the demos easier. Okay. By the way, one little side note. People have asked about this little sidebar over here. This is one of the cool little features inside. Scroll There we go. Yeah, so you'll notice under scroll bars here, just type up top scroll bars. So let me just click on that. That over there, you have the ability to set up the bar mode, which is the classic, or you've got map mode, and that gives you that little bar right there. So that way I can go in and mouse over and actually see what's inside of there. And that's a cool little feature inside of 2013. Okay. In any event, let's go back to my little page, and what you're going to notice is right up at the very top, I've got my navigation section. So of course I've got a bunch of anchor tags inside of there, and I want to style those. So maybe I want to make them bold, and maybe I want to take away the underline that's on them. So maybe those are the two things that I want to be able to do to that. Well, that's perfect for navigation, because if I'm looking at a page and I see the navigation section, what am I expecting inside of a navigation section? I'm expecting links. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't need that visual clue of an underline. But if I'm looking at an article, I'm going to need something that's going to be some form of a visual clue, and maybe that's an underline, maybe that's a different font color, or something like that. So long and short is the links that I'm going to have in an article, I probably want to look a little bit different than the ones that I have over here. All right, well, how can I tackle that? Well, one way that I could potentially tackle that, since we know we're not going to be able to just simply say A and apply that to all anchor tags, because that's going to apply globally, so we can't do that. One way that I could do this is I could create one class here for my nav section, and then another class over here. But you know, that's going to become a little bit of a pain, because I'm going to have to remember to always put that class in again and again and again and again. And when you start talking about things like Bootstrap, I'm going to bring up Bootstrap again, which is very class driven, you're going to find that you've got a little bit of HTML and a ton of class mentions. So if we can do something without having to always add in a class, that's going to make our lives easier. So that way we don't have to remember to always put it into there. We've got a lot less clutter on our page, and we're able to say, based on the document structure, this is how we want something to look. On top of that, if I later move something from one spot to another somewhere on my page, because of the fact that we're using those pseudo elements, those pseudo classes, or the document structure selectors, it's automatically going to pick up that style based on where I put it. So really a better way to do things. So let's start off by taking a look at how we can identify things based on document structure. So let's take a look at a little bit of CSS here, and let's talk about our parent-child and our containers. Now inside of CSS, on the selector, if I say class and class, so nav A, for example, what I'm saying is I'm looking for an anchor tag anywhere inside of that nav element. So I've got a nav element, inside of there there's an anchor, and it's only going to apply to an anchor that's inside of a nav bar. If, however, I add in that little angle bracket, and it's subtle, but it makes a huge difference, then the anchor tag must be a direct child of, in this case, nav. I think the best way to do it is to see it.
Yeah.
Let's get in and actually dig into it. Okay. So let me open up my little nav section here, and here's my little style, and I'm going to start off by doing this the incorrect way. And I sort of like starting with the incorrect way, and that way we can see, wait a minute, nothing happened, and then we go back and make it work. So remember that with that little angle bracket, what that's going to mean is it has to be a direct child. And if we take a look at our structure here, what we're going to notice, there's all of our anchor tags. Those are obviously not direct children of nav, because they're all inside of LI, all inside of UL. List item, unordered list. And then nav. So this is not going to work. So if I go in and I say text decoration, none, and I say font, weight, and let's say bold, what you're going to notice is if I I do have my browser. There it is. Perfect. Let's go ahead and hit refresh. And you're going to notice no change because that angle. So if I take that away, and now I save and I come back over here and I hit refresh, now you're going to notice everything is bold, and you're also going to notice that all of my underlines are gone. By the way, I'm going to do this real quick as well. I'm just going to globally apply this font family, and let's use a Verdana. I think that's just going to make things a little bit easier. There we go. I think that looks a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of serif fonts on screen, just ever.
Okay, perfect. All right. So this makes you much happier then?
Yes.
Okay.
But I wasn't going to say anything otherwise.
All right. I appreciate that.
I'm polite.
And I appreciate that. Okay. So what you're going to notice here is that now my underlines are gone, and now it's bold, again because of that space rather than the angle bracket. So let me just kind of put in the comment here. Space is going to be contained inside of element. And let me just also put in a comment right here, is that the angle bracket indicates a direct parent-child relationship. There we go. And again, we will be sharing all of this out on GitHub. I'll go in and check all of those, and we'll put the links into the chat window, because I know everybody's probably wondering where they can go get all of this. All right, cool. So there's very kind of simple, based on where it happens to be, we want to go in and highlight things. And that's good, and that's perfect for things like this. But you know, let's come back over to our little section over here, and maybe what we want to be able to do on the text is maybe we want to be able to highlight kind of the first letter, or maybe we want to be able to highlight the first paragraph and then use a different font down below and things like that. And fortunately, we can go in and clean all of that up. I am going to do one real quick thing, only just because it's bothering me. Heather's going to talk about this a little bit later, but I am just going to do padding bottom, and let me just do 20 pixels. There we go. That it was really bugging me. I needed a little bit of space there.
No, I get it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So like I said, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to identify, for example, the first letter, or the first paragraph, or the first block, or maybe based on something being highlighted. That is where pseudo classes and pseudo elements come into play. Now, the difference between a pseudo class and a pseudo element is very subtle, syntax, and both just sort of semantically, technically. That a pseudo class is going to apply to an entire element. And that's based on where that element is, or based on the current state. So if somebody has put their mouse over it, if somebody has highlighted it, actually highlighted isn't right, but if somebody's put their mouse over it, if it's at the top, if it's at the bottom, if it's the last item, if it's an odd item, if it's an even item, etc., all of that is where pseudo classes come into play. So rather than me explicitly having to say dot and then the name of a class, and then inside of HTML saying class equals, it's going to be based on something about that element. So for example, it might be the first item in the hierarchy. So maybe we want to bump up the font size just a little bit on the first paragraph, and then a slightly smaller font on everything else. Or maybe for the last item, that we know the last item that's going to be down at the very bottom, it's going to be inside of a div tag, but we know that that's where our copyright is going to be, so maybe we want to make that smaller. Then we can go in and do that. Or maybe we want to apply a style if it happens to be the only child. So maybe this is a search results page, and what we want to display is, sorry, no results found, and we want that to appear with a particular type of font. We can do all of that with pseudo classes. So pseudo classes are all based on something about that element, based on where it is or based on what's going on. So it could be based on position. So first child, last child, the nth child inside of its particular parent. By the way, the nth child, you will notice, will actually take a number, or you can also use the text odd, and even. Now, for anybody who's been programming HTML for a little while, you're probably all familiar with having to go in and try to set something up for that, that different shading for odd or for even. There, problem solved. Odd, even, done. So much easier. Okay, and then you'll also notice that we've got position and type. And this one really, I think, is subtle. I don't want to use the word confusing. But it definitely is subtle. And here's the way that this is going to work. Let me, there we go, do this. Let's say I said div colon first of type, and then I set, whatever my style happened to be. And then let's, up here, say that I said div, and I said first child, like this. There we go. All right, so what's the difference between me saying first child and me saying first of type? It's a great question. And the answer is that first of type is going to be based on where that div tag is on the entire page. So it's the absolute first div tag. Contrast that with first child. First child is going to be based on its parent container. And let's do this. Let's go back into Visual Studio here. I think this is going to be sort of an easier way to drill into this. So let's open up my couple little sections here, and we'll leave it like this. Okay. So what I want you to notice is there is my little section in a div tag, and there is my little section in a div tag. Now, in both of these cases here, these both are first child. The reason that they're both first child is because they're both the first child of that section element. So they're the first div tag inside of that section. So if I wanted to do something with the first paragraph in each section, I can now do that. But this one right here also happens to be the first of type. Why? Because it's the first div tag that appears anywhere on my page. So first child, based on the parent, first of type, first time that that thing appears anywhere. Now, for me, in my personal experience, I generally don't find myself using first of type all that often, but I do find myself using last of type periodically. And again, it's for that little section down at the very bottom. So that way, if you've got, all of your little links about, now hiring and about us and the copyright and all of that, and that's contained inside of a div, and you know that that's always going to be at the end, that's perfect. That way you can just simply say last of type, and I know that that's always going to be the case. In fact, here, let's just go in and we'll add that right in. Let me just add in a div right down here, and now hiring. And whatever it is that we want to do. Okay, so let's go in and style all of that. So here's what I want to do, is I want to bump up the font size just a little bit of the initial paragraphs, and I want to make that bottom section, let's just say red, just to kind of make it very, very obvious there. Okay, and let me also, I'm just going to say font size, and I'm going to say 16 pixels. And let me see, how's that going to look here? Okay, that's perfect, actually. Excellent. All right. So now, let me go in, and I want to grab first paragraph of each section. And if you remember, our paragraphs are currently set up as div tags. Okay. So I'm going to say div, colon, and then you'll notice I've got first child. And then I can just say curly brace, and now I can say font size, and let's go ahead and make that 20 pixels, which is probably bigger than we would really want it, but I'm trying to make it really obvious here. So first child, and now let's come back over here, let's hit refresh, and now you'll notice that's nice and big, and let's scroll down, there's our second paragraph, our third paragraph, our fourth paragraph, and our fifth paragraph in that section. And then you'll notice once again, big. And let me update the text. I think that's also going to make it a little bit more obvious here. So let's just go in and say first in section, scroll on down, and first in section. And now let's come back over here, hit refresh, and then you'll notice that that one is nice and big. Scroll on down, small, 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 and then again nice and big. You're looking at me like you have a question.
Could you scroll up in the code? Why is it that, so what is the first child of div?
Okay, so that's a great question because that's sort of the way that it reads, that it looks like it's saying, I'm looking for the first child of the div tag, but it's not. So what a pseudo class or pseudo element applies to is to the tag in question. So I'm not looking for a child of div. I'm looking for div and I'm trying to see what it's a child of. So that's a great question because when you look at it, and I did that too when I first looked at this, when I was first learning this, is that I looked at that and I said, wait a minute, is this looking for the first child inside of div? It's not. It's looking at the div tag and looking at the structure of the div tag. So it's not looking at the contents of the div tag, it's looking at the div tag itself and seeing, is it the first child of something? So great question, great question. Okay, now let's also go in and say div, and I'm going to say last of type, and then let's just go in and say color colon blue, and let's say font size, and let's make that 12 pixels. Okay, and now let's again come back, hit refresh, and now what you're going to notice. You weren't supposed to do that. Ha! You're not supposed to do it that way. All right, in any event, it's actually putting it on the section, which it's not supposed to do. It's supposed to be on the page itself. So this is just sort of making a liar out of me. See, we're really cooking on the show. Live demos. Live demos right here in front of you.
We told you guys CSS is finicky, and this is one of the cases.
Exactly. All right. So in any event, so last of type is supposed to be the last of that item. I'm just going to make that go away for right now. That's really weird. I'll have to go back and work with that later. We're really cooking here. All right. In any event, so what I want you to notice, just to kind of review this, is that this allows me to, again, based on the document structure, do something different with it, which is cool. Now, I did one little thing inside of my Visual Studio here, and that is I hit Control-K, Control-D. Two-part shortcut, Control-K, Control-D, which formats the document. One of the things that you're going to notice about CSS is that this is going to get very big very quickly. And so formatting becomes a very important component. And so you'll notice there's my div, and then there is a pseudo class for div. And so you'll notice that that is tabbed in, and that is a best practice. So whatever you want globally, and then all of the pseudos you're going to want tabbed in. Okay, cool, cool, cool. Back to slides. There we go. Now, how about, rather than based on document structure, how about element state, based on what's going on? So maybe we want something to look different if you've clicked on it. Then maybe we want to bold it, like a checkbox. Or maybe if you hover over something, then we want to put the underline back onto it. Because if I go back to my page here, and let's just go all the way back up to the very top, we're going to notice there's our nav section. Okay, that's all, peachy keen, hunky-dory. But, it still would be really, really nice if we could make that more obvious, that that's a link. So when you put your mouse over it, it'd be nice to see an underline, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sure enough, we can do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say nav a colon and then hover. Hover, of course, just like the JavaScript. You hover over something. That's going to be when the mouse is over it. And then let's go ahead and say text decoration, and let's say underline. Cool. Save. let's come back over here. Let's hit refresh. And now you're going to notice when I put my mouse over it that sure enough, we get those little underlines. So now I can clearly say, oh, look, okay, that is, in fact, a link. Cool. Now, let's come back over here real quick. And I want to highlight one other thing. So again, you're going to notice that the syntax colon in my pseudo class there. But you are going to notice that I can still go in and use everything else that I've used. So if you remember, that space, of course, means contained inside of an element. So this is now going to say that this is only going to apply to an anchor tag when somebody mouses over it, and that anchor tag is inside of a nav section. So you can get as explicit as you want when going in and defining those elements and how you want everything to look inside of a page. Cool. How about maybe finding the first letter or the first line of something? Or how about going in and doing something different based on selection? Because, you know, I don't know about you, but I've never been a huge fan of the blue background white text. You know, would it be nice to kind of do a yellow highlight? I mean, really, when you think about highlighting, what do you think of?
A highlighter.
Absolutely.
It's funny because this is something Chris really, really cares about. He made me change the highlighting in Visual Studio yesterday to yellow.
That's a true story. I did in fact do that. Yes. See, it has to be yellow. All right. Everybody has their thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But in any event, so I want to make that yellow. Now, let's compare and contrast here. So when I hover over those little links, I'm hovering over the entire link, so that entire element. And if you remember, classes apply to element, so that's a pseudo class. If I highlight a section like I've done here, I've highlighted a portion of an element. So not the entire element, just a portion of the element. If we're going to be talking about first line, which is just going to be that right there, that's just that first line. So again, it's a portion of an element. So a pseudo element is where we're actually going to be creating an element on the fly. Now look, I know some of you are probably thinking, wow, that really seems to be, you know, kind of splitting hairs. That's really kind of a semantic argument. And I'm with you. I generally don't focus too much on pseudo class versus pseudo element. The syntax is slightly different. You are going to notice that it's going to be a single colon versus a double colon. But here's the thing. With Visual Studio, if you hit a colon, it's automatically going to show you all of the pseudo classes, 1 colon, and all of the pseudo elements, 2 colons, right there. So if you don't want to have to worry about trying to remember whether or not something was, 2 colons or 1 colon, you don't have to worry about it. Just, let Visual Studio kind of do its thing. And if you don't want to have to remember the little debate about, pseudo elements versus pseudo classes, that's fine. You don't have to. That's the good news. Okay. Let's do a demo here. So let me go back in and let's go grab our little div tags and let's go in and say div, and I am going to do our selection, and you'll notice that I typed in colon and selection. So I didn't even type in the second colon, but again, the IntelliSense still works. So let's go ahead and take advantage of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say color colon black, and I'm going to say background color colon yellow. There we go. And then let's also go in and say div colon, and I'm going to say my first letter, and let's go in and let's say font size, and let's make this nice and big. So let's say 36 pixels. And let's go in and say div first line. There we go. And let's go in and say font size, and let's make that 24. Let's also kind of make it a little bit more obvious as well. Let's go in and say font color. Oops, not font color. I knew I was going to do that eventually as well. And let's just make that green. Okay. 24 pixels. Cool. So now, if I come back over here to Visual Studio and I hit refresh, here's what I want you to notice. Is you're going to notice, sure enough, that first line is green. And you're going to notice that that first character is nice and big. And you're also going to notice, there we go, yellow background. See, that makes me happy when I go in and I select it. But my browser and all of that is set currently to full screen. So my first line is going from here to here. Okay, fine. But how about if I were to go in and I were to resize this? You'll notice that when I resize this, that it's still just that first line. There's no JavaScript here. None whatsoever. This is all based on CSS. And in fact, when we get into a later module, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is really try to avoid JavaScript. If you can get CSS to do it, let CSS do it. That's going to make your life that much easier. Okay, in any event, let me also do this real quick. Yeah.
Yeah, so when Christopher was highlighting, you might have noticed that the first letter was still blue when he selected it, but everything else was yellow.
Keep talking.
And that's because, as we said before, it's what you select. What was the phrase that you used? The last...
Oh, last right.
Last right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you'll see in the code that the selection is being used before, or I guess this is much better to say, the first child is set after the selection is set,
right.
So that, in essence, overwrites that.
Exactly. Exactly. And you could go in and start moving things around and tweak things. And that's where, going in and testing all of that really becomes very important. Okay. Now, sort of in the background, one of the things that I want you to notice is I made a real quick change here. And again, this sort of goes back to one of the things that we talked about earlier, is that you'll notice that I was able to do nav a : hover. So that's only going to apply to A tags inside of nav. And if we came back to our article and we kind of think about what it is that I was trying to accomplish here, is I want the first paragraph to be big, because that's probably where the important stuff is, and I want the first line to be big, and I want the first letter, just for stylizing things, I want that to be big. So I want all of that to really be highlighted. But I only want that really for just the first paragraph inside of each section. So for the second paragraph, I just want it to be normal. Just, back to the way that it was. And if you remember, the way that I had it the first time, which was like this, little musical interlude for you. There we go. Let's go back in, hit refresh. And you'll notice, here's a second paragraph right here. And you'll notice that that first line is big and it's green and my first letter is nice and big. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I wanted. I just wanted that for that first paragraph. And sure enough, we can combine all of these as much as we want. So we can get as explicit on identifying the elements as we need to. So it makes it gives us a lot of power in going in and finding what we want.
Yeah. So again, because I see these in the questions.
Yeah.
Why is it that we use one set of colons for first child and two sets of colons for first letter? It's because, well, actually, Christopher,
sure.
You can answer this.
Here, let me just go in and do this. Is that one set of colon? This is for our pseudo class, and then the second set of colon is a pseudo element. So two sets of colon is a pseudo element. The one set of colon is a pseudo class. And about the best analogy that I can give, and forgive me, this is the best one that I can come up with. I took 4 years of French in high school. Bonjour, comment allez-vous? Je m'appelle Christopher. Ma grand-mère est flambée et le singe est disparu, which is a horrible American accent way of saying hello. My name is Christopher. My grandmother's on fire and the monkey has disappeared. At least I think that's what I said. In any event, one of the hardest things that I struggled with when I was trying to learn French was trying to remember the genders of everything. So la versus la. And in a lot of ways, I think that's sort of the same thing here, is that pseudo-class versus pseudo-element. Is there a difference? Technically, yes, there is, because pseudo-class is going to apply to the entire class. When you hover over something, you're hovering over, sorry, the entire element. When you hover over something, you're hovering over that entire element. When you select something, though, or when you talk about first letter, or you talk about first line, that's a portion of an element. So hover, you're hovering over the entire element. First letter, that's a portion of an element. So hover, because of the fact that it's already going to apply to an entire element, that's a class. The first letter, because of the fact that that's only a portion of an element, we need to create a brand new one. We need to do it on the fly. It's a pseudo element. That's why it's a pseudo element. That's honestly a very academic thing. I wouldn't really worry about trying to commit all of that to memory, and just let Visual Studio sort of guide you. I'll be honest, that's all that I ever do. The only time that I ever worry about pseudo-class versus pseudo-element is when I'm teaching CSS. When I'm using CSS, I'm not even thinking about it. Then I'm just going in, a colon, and then just finding the item that I want. And if Visual Studio throws in a second colon, fantastic. And if it doesn't, fantastic. And I'm being real here. That's the way that I do it. I'm sure that's the way that you do it. And anybody else who's experienced with CSS, I'm certain that's the way that they do it as well. So if you want to get very, very technical, very, very propeller head, that's the difference between the two. Personally, I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Some of you are also asking, why do the pseudo classes go before the pseudo elements? And I mean, that's just, it's order of, I guess, size is the best way I would put it. I mean, one, like Christopher just said, applies to the entire element.
Right.
I mean, the pseudo classes apply to the entire element. Whatever properties put on it is for the entire element. Whereas the pseudo element is a smaller part of that. So it goes from less specific to more specific, and that's the way you would order it in your CSS selector.
Exactly, yeah, because I'm trying to drill down into it. So I'm starting at the div tag, so I'm looking for, hey, I want a div tag. Okay, now inside this div tag, I'm looking for just the first one.
Yeah.
And so then inside of just that first one, now I want that first letter. So I'm really just kind of drilling right down on into it. So yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah, because it wouldn't make sense if you said, well, what is the first child of a selected line? I mean, that's not something that really makes sense. Logic-wise, I don't know how that.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and again, it gives you that ability to go in and find exactly what it is that you're looking for. Now, again, those of you that have done CSS, you're probably looking at my demos thus far, and you're probably complaining about two very big things. The first thing that you're probably complaining about is the fact that I'm putting all my CSS into that file. Again, I'm doing that just to make my demos easier. The second thing you're probably complaining about is you'll notice that I've hard-coded in all of those font sizes. So I said that I want it to be 20 pixels and 36 pixels and so forth. That's really not a good practice, because the problem with that is that as things resize, I would then have to go into each item and resize it. So if I wanted a different font size for mobile, and I wanted a different font size for tablets, and I wanted a different font size for printing, I would then have to go in and resize everything. And I've got way too many better things to do with my time than try to, resize everything. So let's have a discussion then about sizing and about some sizing best practices here. Now, you are going to notice that CSS does give you the ability to do absolute sizes. And I'm going to say right away, just stay away from centimeters. millimeters and inches, because it's never going to come out the way that you want it to. Just stay away from those and really focus in on picas, points, pixels, and for me personally, I don't know if you use something different. I always find myself reaching for pixels just because I find that I get the most consistency across all devices, and I find that it comes out the best. I don't know if you're different. Okay.
I do the same. Also, I mean, when you're sizing things besides text, you usually would use pixels or use something relative. So pixels, just across the board, it's good.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the thing about pixels is that it's an absolute size. So if I say I want something to be this many pixels, guess how big it's going to be? That many pixels. Period. End of sentence. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could just set a size somewhere as our base, and then size everything else based off of that base? And that's where our relative sizes come into play. Now, the two main relative sizes that I want to highlight here are EM and REM. Now, EM is based on the font size of the current element. So if I go in and I set up, let's say div, and I set that to be 16 pixels, and I want to do something based on that for the first letter, then I would want to use EM because it's based on the current element. REM, however, is an 80s, 90s alternative band. No, REM is based on the size of the HTML element, which, by the way, is 16 pixels by default. So let's actually go back in and kind of size things a little bit better here. So you'll notice 16 pixels up top. So rather than me going in and saying our font size of 20 pixels, let's size it based off of that main font. So I just want it a bit bigger than that main font. So let's say that I want that to be about 25% bigger. So 1.25 of REM. So you can think about it as a percent. That's always the way that I think about it. So 125% or 1.25 of that REM. So it's going to be a little bit bigger. And in the case of our first, we want that much, much bigger. So let's go in and maybe set that to be 2.25 REM. And in this particular case, we want that, a scotch bigger. And let's go in and say 1.50 REM. And do I have any other sizes in here? I think I'm good. I'm good. Okay, cool. So now let's come back over to my browser and let's go ahead and hit refresh. And you're going to notice there's not a lot of change on my screen, because I basically kept everything reasonably close. And unless you're, busting out a ruler and measuring everything, you're probably not noticing any real difference until I do this. So all it takes now is for me to make one change. And I'm going to make a drastic change here. I'm going to change this to 10, which I know is very, very small. But the takeaway that I want you to get is that the moment I do that, everything else goes in line with it. And I really should also have updated this as well. Let's go 1.25 REM. There we go. And so now, if I resize that, you'll notice everything else goes in line with it. And this becomes very powerful when we're talking about our page layouts and our media queries, because I'm going to want to be able to resize our fonts for tablets and for desktops. And I don't want to have to go in, especially if I've got something like this, where, I've got, like 4 or 5 different options now for div tags and all sorts of different font sizes. I don't want to have to go in and resize each one of those for each individual screen size. So I don't have to. So all I have to do is one single update and everything else falls in line. Make your life easier. Go with relative sizes. Set that size once and go relative from there on out. If you need something to be an explicit size, then obviously, yes, use explicit sizing. But especially when you're talking about things like fonts and trying to work in a mobile-first world, go with relative sizes. It's going to make your life that much easier.
Yeah. So what would have happened if you changed it from REM to EM?
That's a fantastic question. So if I would have changed it from REM to EM, so let's let's do this. I'm going to go with kind of the big one here, which is our first letter. Actually, no, what do I want? I want this. I'm going to change this to EM, and I'm going to go really big here. So I'm going to go 3 EM, and I'm going to go in, and I'm going to hit refresh here. And you'll notice that I'm getting a much bigger space there because of the fact that it's still coming off of my HTML. So it's coming off of the parent because that's now flowing down to everything else. So EM versus REM here isn't going to make a huge difference. But let's talk about this first letter and this first line, because that's really where EM shines. Because remember, what's my goal? My goal with using that first line and that first letter was really to try and highlight that versus the rest of the paragraph. So I want that to be bigger based on the rest of the paragraph. So that's where EM is going to shine. So I don't want to do it based off the rest of the document. I want to do it based off of this. So I want it to be much bigger than the rest of that. So maybe I want that first letter to be 3 times as big as that div section. And I want that first line to be, let's say, 2 times as big as that div section. So I go in and I say 3 EM and I say 2 AM, and I come back and I hit refresh, and you'll notice it's nice and big. Now let's again kind of keep going with that compare and contrast here. Where's my div tags? Trying to think of a really good, okay, let's go off of first child here. And I'm going to explicitly size my first child here. I think this is going to kind of bring it all together here. And I'm going to make this really big. I'm going to say 30 pixels. Okay, now this is going to be, I think, a good example of REM versus EM. EM is going to be based off of this, because I've now said that that first child, I want that to be 30 pixels. EM is going to be based off of that. So this should be 90 pixels big, as opposed to whatever was inside of HTML, which, if I remember right, was currently set to 10, so it should be 30. So if it was REM, that would be 30. EM is going to be 90 pixels. I think I'm doing my math right. Hit save, hit refresh. Yes, that's 90 pixels. So you'll notice that that's huge, and you'll also notice, kind of as a perfect example, that that up there wasn't impacted. That's still going to be, in this case, our 10 pixels. So there's the difference in action of EM versus REM. So EM is based off of that current element. REM is based off of whatever was set on HTML. Does that bring that together?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Cool. All right. Now, up until now, I've got to fix that. Hold on one second. Control Z. That's just going to drive me crazy. Control Z and Control Z, and let's go back and change that to 16. Okay. Now then. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this back up in Internet Explorer, and I'm going to fire up Chrome here. Now, what you're going to notice is, on the whole, these are similar, but you are, going to notice that they're certainly not the same, that the font size is definitely different in Chrome versus IE. And this is going to be one of the biggest challenges that you're going to have working with CSS, is that, like you mentioned earlier, and I think you put it perfectly, which was essentially that CSS is a standard by the W3C, and they essentially suggest that browsers do this, this, and this, but it's not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination. So a lot of different things will work in one browser, but won't necessarily work in another browser. And sometimes the difference is going to be pretty drastic. Sometimes it's not going to be as bad. So you will always have to go in and play around from browser to browser to browser to make sure that things work well in all browsers, or at least are kind of close enough in all browsers. And so you'll notice on the sizing here that the sizing is going to be handled. Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. There we go. See, it was funny because I'm looking at this and I'm going, I know that all of that's supposed to work in Chrome and it's not, and I'm just going to kind of roll with it. There we go. Okay, so all of that works better. There we go. Now, here's one spot where things can differ, and Chrome may have updated this real recently. So if all of a sudden this works the way that it's supposed to work in Chrome, then they updated it. One very cool thing that you can do is you can also size things based on the screen size. And that's by using VW or VH. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that it's not supported in all browsers. And you'll notice that it winds up being that unit of measurement is 1% of the viewport, so the portion of the screen that you're currently looking at, the width and the height. So if I go back in to Visual Studio here, and let me grab my article, and let's say that I want my article's width, and I only want that to take up, let's say, 75% of the screen, I could say 75 VW, viewport width. And so if I go in and I hit save, and I come back over here to Chrome, and I come back over here to Internet Explorer, okay, cool. Chrome did update this. This actually is relatively new. What you're going to notice is that there is now that little bit of white space, and it's all based on the size of the browser. Now, the point that I was really trying to make here, kind of bringing it all the way back to where I started by opening up Chrome, is you do have to be careful with CSS because things change over time. So it was like 2 months ago that I last went in and kind of worked around with that, and that wasn't there, that wasn't supported. It is now supported. You always have to test in all browsers. Always have to test in all browsers. Okay. All right. Anything else to there?
I think that was a really good explanation of the different sizes. I think especially a discussion of REM versus EM, that sizing thing.
Yeah.
Great explanation.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And then we're going to come on back and we're going to take a look at page layout. So we took a look at how to go in and select all of our items. Now it's time to actually examine how we can put things where we want them and stop using tables. All right, we'll see you guys in 10 minutes.
We're going to talk about how to position your elements on the page. So, how to make something stay at the top of the page, how to make elements sit next to each other nicely, how to center things, how to position those elements, as well as what goes into sort of the position of an element. What is, not to get too philosophical here, but what is an element? What is it, seriously,
Yeah.
What is it composed of? Which is the box model. An element is not simply the content, it's also the stuff around the content.
So an element isn't just an element. There's more to it than
Yes.
just simply just that individual tag.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And we're also going to talk about how elements can interact with each other and sort of disrupt each other on a page, and how we can solve those issues.
Okay.
So at the end of the slide, or at the end of this module, I'm hoping to get a page like this. So it's not beautiful, but it's a rough estimate of what a landing page, what a pretty modern day landing page would look like. And we're going to basically position all these elements that I've put in here, and get from this to this.
Perfect. I love it.
Great. So first, we should talk about the display property. This really gets an element to actually display on a page. And there's a lot of different HTML elements, as you guys well know. And there are a couple types. Two main types, really. The first is a block level element, and those are the typical elements that you're thinking of: paragraphs, divs, forms, headings, anything that really takes up an entire row for itself on the page. There are also then inline elements like spans, links. If you're using the B tag for bolding something, that's an inline element, and they don't take up an entire page. You can think of these roughly as things that could go inside of a paragraph or inside of something else.
Okay.
And I think that's an easy shortcut to think about it. Not exactly, but that gets you into the right idea. And you can also display things not only as block or as inline. You can also completely hide an element from the page using display none. And that's a bit different from something else that you might have heard about called visibility none. Visibility none basically takes an element and hides it, but still basically has a placeholder size for it on the page. Display none actually hides the element altogether. So if you had 3 things and you hit the middle one, then it would basically collapse into 2. Whereas if you use visibility none, you would basically have 1 and then a blank space and then 3. That makes sense.
So display none completely disappears. Visibility, there's nothing that's going to be there, but it's just going to be white space, if you will, that's right there.
Yeah. So, something funny I saw was, it's basically like a ninja. It's there, but you don't see it. Or an invisibility cloak.
Okay. I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
One little thing that's worth highlighting, though, is especially for people who are doing server side, is that HTML is still sent down to the client. So if somebody went in and viewed the source, they'd still be able to see the text behind the scenes. They're just not seeing it on the browser screen.
Yeah, it's just a good way to sort of dynamically hide elements on the page if you need to do that. For instance, we'll get into this later on, but if you're resizing a page, like based on screen size, it's very helpful there. And then there's
No, go ahead.
Is that confusing?
No.
Okay,
no.
Great. And there's the last thing.
I just always have this confused look on my face. It's just me.
Okay, just checking. But the last thing that could be a little bit confusing is that there's an inline block type element. So a block type element, typically needs a whole row for itself. An inline block element basically allows you to collapse a bunch of block elements onto the same row. So, for example, if you had like 3 cards that you wanted to show on the same page, each in a little div, you would be able to do that by setting them to inline blocks rather than just block elements.
Okay.
So actually, if we go to my example here, you can see that these are all inline blocks, but without styling. They're just block elements. They're just sitting one behind each other.
So
like
those
this.
are all contained inside of div tags, and so the div tags are just going to go top to bottom there.
Yeah, and I can show you that in the F12 tools. You'll see, they're just like very basic boxes, and they don't have an inline block element like inline block property like these do. Let me open this up. Yeah, you'll see they're shown as display inline block.
Okay.
And you can also see that if you, let me disable this, they automatically go back to being one behind another.
All right. So that normal block is just going to go down, down, down. That inline block they're still separate elements, but they're not automatically going to go down to the next line, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, it's a pretty common use case. Yeah, sometimes you don't want everything to go one single file down the page. Sometimes you just want 2 things next to each other.
Right.
And that makes it easy, or makes it possible even. Something else that we should talk about, the second most important thing in having something show up on the page is the position property. So the display, makes sure it shows up, but the position actually talks about where it is. Or how to determine where it is, shall I say. So the first type is, there's a couple of types for this. The first is static, and that's basically the default, completely unformatted way of having a position. So it'll just sit exactly where it should be on the page by default. The second is relative. So that is relative to where its default position would be on a page. So for instance, if something is if something is a first element, so if it was, if you had an element that was, how do I do this? Never mind. Basically,
Go ahead.
Basically, you had an element in the top right corner of something, and you want to shift that down a little bit. Shift it down by 100 pixels or maybe 10% based on the page. You would use the relative because you're basically trying to just move the element relative to where its original place would be. The next one is fixed, and that's just relative to the browser window. And this is especially useful for headers, for instance. You've seen it on a lot of web pages probably, that move with you as you scroll. And the last is an absolutely placed element. These I think are less commonly used, and they can kind of be confusing. Absolute elements are put basically exactly where you position it. So if you give it, I want it to be from the top of the page 100 pixels, from the left of the page 100 pixels, it'll just be right there and nothing else will move it. It doesn't listen to any of the other elements. Whereas a lot of these other ones, they relate to other things. Like for example, the fixed is relative to the browser window, and relative position is relative to where its default place is. So let me show you an example of that.
Yeah, go in and see it. That's always sort of the best way.
Yeah. So for instance, this header right here is a fixed element, right? So when you're moving down the page, it's fixed relative to the browser window.
Nice. So you didn't do any JavaScript or anything fancy like that. You just simply said fixed.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at my HTML code, there's absolutely no JavaScript on this page because I just want to make clear that everything that happens here is based purely on CSS. I don't have any absolutely placed elements on this page because it didn't actually seem like it was necessary to have something just randomly in this in the upper left-hand corner, or something like that on the page. Plus, those would actually scroll with you. So as you're moving past it, it would just go away. And absolutely positioned elements are also just not very flexible, obviously, because you're putting them in one place and they won't necessarily move or shift according to the layout in a pleasant way. So now that we sort of have the groundwork for how all these elements are placed, let's actually go through and place our sort of mismatched elements on our other page.
Okay, so we'll start with that ugly page and actually prettify it.
Yeah, exactly. You'll see in the header here, this is in a list. We'll of course make those in line. We'll make all of this work. But let's start by doing some of our position and element stuff. So this is a base CSS file that I have for that page. As you can see, a lot of these things are actually styled a little bit. Like there are these boxes. I've changed the background color. These aren't important to positioning, so I just put that in there. So we're not starting with a completely blank page. That I tried it. I tried to put that in the demo. That actually does take forever.
Yeah. And you had to get rid of that serif font.
Of course. It's the first thing you have to do. Although, like what Chris had before, something that's nice to put here is in case they don't have Arial. I don't really know people who won't have Arial. You can put sans serif just to have a fallback.
Arial, Verdana, they're basically always there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're the good go-tos. Okay, so something we haven't so first we're going to position our header on the page. And something that we haven't really talked about yet is width and height. And these are pretty self-explanatory elements of there's pretty self-explanatory properties of an element. The width, determines how wide it is, and height determines how tall it is. And so you see that I have put a couple of different positions in here. For the header, I stretch it to 100%, and that is 100% basically of what its parent element is. But because header, you can see in my HTML file here, it is sitting right here. It doesn't really have a parent element besides body, and body is just 100% of the page, obviously. That'll automatically stretch to 100% of that page.
Okay, so just to sort of reiterate that, that width at 100% is based on the parent element. It's not based on the browser window. And it just so happens that this is inside of body, so that's why it's 100% of the entire window, because body is the entire window.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, we can go through and we can show this to be, if we change body to be with 50%, and this would just, or I guess we should do 500 pixels to make that a bit more clear.
Ah, I like that. Okay.
And we refresh this. Yeah, you'll see that the entire body is now 500 pixels, and then, but the header block is still 100% of the width here.
Okay.
So you'll see here, body is just that 500 pixels across, and then so is header though, because it's 100% of that.
I like it.
Yeah, so let's go through and undo this. We don't want, that kind of a page. And we're also setting height here. We're setting height in pixels. So as Christopher talked about before, there are a bunch of ways that you could set these values. And in here, setting element sizes as well as text sizes, you can use things like EM to make it relative to the size of text. I'm just going pixels here because that makes sense. You want your header to be at the top of the page at a fixed height. So I'm just setting it to that. And what I'm going to do now is, going back to positioning, I'm going to set its position to actually be fixed. So it sits at the top of the page.
Okay.
So let's see what happens now.
So you just made one little change there. You just simply said fixed.
Yeah, I simply said fixed for the position, and now if you see, when I start scrolling, that element stays at the top of the page. Now it's worth noting that there's some spacing issues. We're going to get to that in the box model part.
Okay.
So don't worry about that for now.
All right.
We're also going to change some of the elements in our header because you'll see we don't want our header to be, or our header links to be vertical. We want them to be horizontal on the page, like this.
Okay.
So we can do that by simply making these list items inline instead of block, like they are by default. And so what we can basically do for that is we can say display inline. And once we save that, when we refresh here, they'll of course be in a line.
Okay. All right. So by default it was block, so boom, boom, boom down the list, and now inline it's all going to be horizontal.
Exactly. So yeah, inline just allows these elements to sit next to each other. It's not necessary to use inline block for elements like this, where they're still small and they could be part of like I said before, something that could be part of a paragraph, like I said before. I just use inline, but we will use inline block for a couple of other things. So I'm just tabbing all over the place here. You'll see in this page, for instance, we have these two elements. We have this sort of side text here and this image being on the same line. And you can achieve that using inline block.
Okay.
We also have all of these sort of cards here of all the things that we theoretically teach in each of our modules. I left them blank. I was going to put some lorem ipsum in there, but then it just seemed like we were teaching you rubbish, so I left them blank for now. But yeah, these are also inline block. And actually, one nice thing about inline block is that they automatically they automatically will reseat themselves based on your viewport size or your browser. So so those kind of adapt depending on your display.
Okay.
So we're going to set two things to inline block. We're going to set three things to inline block. We're going to set the side text and this image to inline block, and we're also going to set all of these boxes to inline block. Okay. So in Visual Studio, you'll see. Okay, let me show you the code for this first. You'll see that the banner text and the banner text is that large header that we had, and the side text and the CSS image are what we want side by side. So that's within the hero block, and it's important to note that when these are inline, they're inline relative to their parent. And our boxes are not actually IDs, but they're classes. Since they're all the same style, it just makes sense to put them in a class rather than giving them all individual IDs and styling each of those. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to set this to display inline block. That'll set all the boxes, and we're also going to set our, where is it? Side text display to inline block. And our CSS image to display inline block. And so now, when we refresh this page, you'll see that they're on the same line again. Now, there are some issues with the positioning. For instance, this transform and transitions, because it has a two-line title, it's up a little bit. And this side text is sort of, it's aligned to the bottom rather than the top with this image, which is what we want. And that is mostly because of how the CSS box model works.
Okay.
Which is something that we're going to talk about. Why is that happening?
Right.
And the CSS box model basically describes what are all the components of an element on the page. It's not just the content, right? It's also all the things that go around it. So you can think of the CSS box model as actually just a box. There's some content in the middle, and then between the content and the border, which you can set to a certain style, you could have the padding. So everything that's sort of inside here is inside the element, and then outside of this is the margin, which is basically the space that you want other elements to stay away from you on. So a good way to think about this is, for instance, if you set the background of this entire element, it would go sort of like this in sort of color. It would go from the padding on, right?
Okay.
So that would encompass all of the color, but the margin would stay clear because that's sort of viewed as outside of the border of it. Now, so the margin is a space outside of an element. The border is the visible border around the element. And the padding is a space within the element, but outside of the actual content that you have inside of it. This is kind of a little bit confusing because when you think about when you think about the size of a box, you don't really think about the size of it, including like some space around it. You're really thinking about the size of a box, right? So if you had a cardboard box and you're measuring the side of it, you would be measuring from the outside of the box on one side to the outside of the box on the other side. You wouldn't necessarily go inside it and just like measure how much the box can store. That doesn't really make sense as a way of measuring. And so there's something called the box sizing attribute that really changes this and makes that much easier. So basically, instead you can change this to border box so that it will actually measure your when you're doing width, it'll measure from here to here, and that'll be sort of the width of the box, and which I think makes sense when you're talking intuitively about an element. And then here to here, I don't really know how to use zoom it, so I'm just drawing squares as lines, or drawing boxes as lines.
That's good.
Hope that's okay with you guys. So yeah, so now if you're using the box sizing as border box, this would be the height, and this would be the width, instead of before where it would encompass other things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And the box sizing, that's one of those new attributes that we talked about. So
that's a CSS3 thing.
Yeah, it's a CSS3 thing. So you set it to be. So it does actually need a vendor prefix specifically for Mozilla Firefox. So you're going to actually need two things. You're going to need a border box. You're going to need to set box sizing, and you're also going to set -moz -box sizing.
Unfortunately, Visual Studio does that for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But those are just some of the quirks that we talked about with CSS implementation, and this is one of the places where it does come up. So, where are the places that we need to actually set box sizing on our page? Well, a good example is actually right here in the header. So let's say we want our text here to not be we want our text to be more centered vertically in our header. So to do that, maybe we can add in some padding on top to kind of push the element down a little bit. Now, what would that look like?
That's a good question. What would that look like?
Yeah, so you would set that in header, and you basically set some padding to basically push elements down inside of it, down a little bit. And you can do padding. You can do padding top to just basically set the top of that to, I'm going to say, 10 pixels.
By the way, while you're there, can I ask you a real quick side question? Because there's a question in the Q&A about the Z index.
Okay. Yeah, the Z index is, okay. So I'll explain why we need it first, and I think that would make a lot more sense.
Yep.
So on this page, you'll see as we're scrolling down,
everything else goes behind.
Yeah, everything is going behind this. And by default, things are at Z index 1. By setting the Z index to a higher number, you're basically saying this element is in front of all the other elements. If we set it to something like -1, then all the other elements would kind of go in front of it, which doesn't make sense as a fixed header, because then you can't really see it anymore. Things are getting in the way. So that's why I'm setting the Z index
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And I just set it to 10. So I like to set things by order of magnitude, not by like 1, 2, or 3. I think it makes things a lot more clear, and that way you can have some granularity if you need it.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm setting this padding top to 10 pixels for this unfinished page. And you'll see that if I refresh the page, I do have more of a padding on top, but it also pushes down the size. It also increases the size of this top header a little bit. And if we look in our F12 tools and we look at the header, we can actually see its layout size here. And you'll see that there's some padding here on top, in addition to the 70 pixels, right? And that sort of, and that increases in like a weird way, so that this entire thing becomes 80 pixels instead of 70. And we don't want that. We want it to be 70 forever. So the way that you can fix that is, like I said, you can set box sizing. So I'll just do box sizing, border box, and for our Mozilla, we'll just go in and do this. And that basically sets the border box specifically for Mozilla. The box sizing thing works the box sizing works out of the box for all the other browsers.
Out of the box? Box sizing, out of the box?
Haha. Unintentional pun, but I'm still going to take credit for it.
By the way, do this for me real quick. Hit a carriage return and type in box sizing again. And one of the things that everybody will notice, hit backspace, one more. Okay, you're gonna have to delete it and bring it back up again. I just want the IntelliSense back up.
Okay.
The box. So you'll notice on box sizing that there's like a little pair of scissors that's next to that. So that's a snippet. So with that highlighted, if you hit tab twice, it'll automatically put in all of the different vendor-specific versions that you need, so that way you don't have to remember each one of them. So Visual Studio can actually do that for you. That's
really cool. I didn't know that.
Yep. Yeah.
And you can just change these elements directly.
Exactly. Yep.
It does have the WebKit box sizing here, but WebKit has now rolled that into their standards, so you don't need it anymore.
Right.
Unless you do want to target, older versions, in which case that's decent practice, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. But we'll go with that for now.
Okay, so we're going to save this, and now when you go and refresh this page, you'll see that this has, again, become 70 pixels. 10 pixels isn't a huge difference, so you might not be able to see it too clearly, but here, if I select this element, you can see now, it's kind of pushed in that element size a little bit to account for the padding.
Okay.
So now instead of it being 80 from like accounting for padding, now it's 70 even accounting for padding. And that's on the F12 Tools, that layout tab, and that's showing you the full box, so that way you can see the sizing of the box and how everything's coming together. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, these can be really finicky, so it's nice to actually see all these things. Yep. And it's especially nice to have this, to have the element selection tool to be able to actually select these. No.
Yep.
Yeah, so we want to set the box sizing for that. And we also want to set sort of and we don't need to set the box sizing for everything, but we might need to set the padding for some things. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's actually supposed to be, this huge title line here, a banner text that says add style with CSS Jumpstart. And that's completely hidden here. It's hidden behind the nav bar.
That's a problem.
Yeah, that is a problem. And the way I'm going to fix that is I'm basically just going to, in the hero block, which is comprised of basically everything in this blue box, I'm going to set some padding on top to basically push the elements inside down a little bit.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I want to show you guys how to set padding for basically all 4 sides at the same time.
Okay.
So instead of doing padding top, you could just simply do padding, and you can put in 4 values.
Okay.
And the values basically go top, right, bottom, left in that order.
So starting from the top, going clockwise.
Exactly.
So top right, bottom left.
Yeah, and so you put in 4 values. And for this, since I'm only setting top, I'm going to set 70, which is the size of the header, and then I'm going to do 0, 0, 0. I don't bother putting pixels in for the other ones because 0 is the same, basically on any scale. It's nothing. It's worth noting, right?
I suppose 0 is 0.
Yeah. But if you do just omit the other numbers, then that basically gives you a 70 pixel padding all around. So on all 4 sides, it'll give you 70. Whereas if you set all each side separately, it'll know that you want all of them to be different.
Perfect.
In our case, it won't matter too much, but I'm just going to set it like this because that makes sense to me.
And now we can see add style with CSS.
Yeah, exactly. And now that's sort of pushed everything else down on the page, which is exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so now now the elements are sort of in the right positions on the page, but they're not aligned in the way that we want them to be,
right.
Or they're not floated on the side of the page like this that we want them to be. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about that next. What happens after you size elements? They still need to interact with each other, mm-hmm. right? And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the float property. This is probably the most commonly used property for anchoring elements on a page. This horizontally anchors an element basically on its row. So if you float elements to the left, it'll stay on the left side, and if you float elements to the right, it's going to stick basically onto the right side. And it also allows other elements to flow around the page. So I have an example down here of basically what a blue box floated onto the right would be. You'll see that the text is, able to flow sort of around it. Mm-hmm. And this was the original use case for float. I mean, when CSS first started, HTML was also intended to be, basically a document, right?
Right.
So it was intended to basically float images around and let text go around this. But since then, float has been sort of co-opted to do other things. And those other things do include basically anchoring an element on its row. So one of the elements that we want to anchor is our large CSS3 badge. Mm-hmm. And we want to anchor that onto the right like this. I know this isn't really pretty, but it does give you a good indication of what floating something onto the right would be.
Absolutely.
You'll also notice that there's some space right here between it and the right side. Mm-hmm. I'm going to show you what that would look like basically if I didn't have the margin there. Yeah, so this is my image, and right now I'm giving it a 10% margin to the right. That way it scales with the page size. If I didn't have that, it would just go directly to the right.
I got you.
So we're going to set a couple of things. We're going to set its float, and we're also going to give it a little margin so it doesn't float just on the edge. So in here, we'll say float right. And we're also going to do margin right 10%. Whoa, 10%. I need to find percent. Okay, great. And similarly, we want to set the left margin for our text to not be exactly on the right left edge of the page, but have a little bit of buffer. So I'm going to do margin left on this, and I'm going to do 10% as well, so it looks a little centered. And now, if we refresh our sort of demo, it'll go like this. Whoa.
All right.
What happened?
Well, we got halfway there, sort of, and then we made a mess of a few other things.
Yeah, and this actually happened because, this is one of those things where elements interacting on the page can do bad things. So right now, basically what happened is our hero block said, oh, wait, if you want to put it there and these are next to each other and this text is here, then this element is actually going to be too big to fit in our box. So basically, it floated it here and then it sort of stranded it outside of the box. There's a pretty good way of just making sure everything that you want inside of the box stays in there, and that's using the overflow property. So if elements sort of overflow from that div, the div will just simply enlarge itself to account for it, instead of simply saying, well, I guess you're out there on your own. So I'm going to say overflow auto, and that should take care of that.
Okay, so that'll automatically resize.
Exactly.
Okay.
So basically, it'll say if an element overflows our div, don't just leave it hanging. Bring it back in. We'll enlarge ourselves to keep it in here.
Okay. One of my favorite little tricks to do with the overflow is to use that scroll. So that way, rather than having to use iframes, you can just set up the div tag. It's got that huge block of text, and you just want scrollability inside of there. If you set that overflow to scroll, it'll automatically just put in a scroll bar inside of there, which is I think a neat little trick.
Yeah, exactly. So you can have a little text box with a scroll bar next to it instead of having a huge chunk of text that would take up the entire page.
Exactly.
So I see this happening all the time. Like when you're buying new software, they're getting you to sign the terms and conditions. That's just they could be using an iframe, but most likely it's going to be an overflow scroll.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And now
those terms and conditions that everybody reads from start to finish.
Oh, I definitely do.
Yeah.
So one thing that I promised you guys I would do that I haven't yet done is I haven't fixed this sort of margin here that's happening with basically in the entire body of the document, and that's because body actually has some default padding and margin on it, and this actually does vary a little bit between browser to browser, but I don't know that I would ever want some space there. So generally what I do is I set margin of the body to just be 0. I want it to take up the entire screen, and I also want there to be no padding. So elements within the body just go from side to side exactly where I would expect it.
Okay.
And once I save that,
that does sort of make sense. I mean, that's the screen where it's displaying. Just give me the entire screen.
Yeah. Why would I want blank space there? I don't understand. But this is just across every browser essentially. But now that we've updated that, you'll see that it's now smooth here again. And the last thing that we want to do with padding is we actually want to pad probably each of these links. So it's not just one chunk of text together, but they actually have some padding left and right. And you can set padding for things for even inline elements. They're not only for block elements. So I'm going to go back in here, and you'll see I did this the descendant selector like we learned before for all, because all the list items within our header are going to be links. Link outs. So I just set it there instead. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do just some padding to the right. I'm going to set that to 20 pixels just to give it a little bit of padding. I'm not going to do left and right because all of them just can go 20 over.
Yeah, that would combine, and now you've got 40 pixels.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just much more exact. I don't want to have to divide it by half. And you'll see that now this is separated a little bit more. But now we also want these to be on the center of the page. I mean, everything else is sort of centered. It's nice to have things centered. And actually, what is interesting is that centering can, once you have inline elements, centering can happen to basically all of them. So we can center all of these links here, and we can center these inline block cards on boxes on the bottom using the same thing. And it's going to be text align. So I know that the boxes on the bottom aren't text, but that is how you indeed align them to be more centered.
So it's sort of like the reverse of the old color, where color is just for the text. Here you actually want to apply it to the element, and you're going to use text as the prefix.
Yeah, this is just a simple way to center your inline elements. There are other ways as well. People set the margins, but I find this to be fairly straightforward. So I'm going to set this. So I'm going to set the block. So actually, I'm setting the text align center, not to the boxes themselves, but to the container of the boxes. So that everything that goes inside that container, which are all the boxes, are automatically centered. So I'm going to set that to here. And then similarly, I'm not going to set these, the header list items to be text align centered.
The entire header.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to set the entire header to be text align.
And while Helen's typing this out, one of the things that's worth noting is with the IntelliSense inside of Visual Studio is it will pick up if you happen to type in the middle of something. So if you forget that it's text align, if you just type align, text align will still show up in the IntelliSense, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's very useful. Because you might not always remember that it's text align to align some elements. But so once we have that, now if we just refresh the page, you'll see that these elements on top in the header are, of course, aligned, but in the center. But also these are centered as well on the bottom. So now, once we minimize the page, I mean, they're always going to be sort of centered. They're not going to look very good, unfortunately, because as you can see, we still have sort of this like off-kilter alignment there. And that's because we haven't actually told inline elements how to align themselves. Like you can, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to say, okay, all of these elements in this box, or all of these elements, align yourselves according to the top. So basically, all you guys should start at the same top edge. So we're going to go in here, and then for each of these boxes, we're going to say top align. Oh, top. Well, let's see.
Vertical.
Vertical, yes. Vertical align. We're going to set vertical align to top. That's where I mix myself up. So once I set my vertical align to top, once we refresh this, you'll see that they're on the same row, which is great, except now they're kind of touching the hero block. And all that we need to do for that is we basically need to set some margin for the container that these boxes are going to be in. So if we go back here, in the modules block, next to text, or under text align centered, we just basically need to give this some margin. We'll just go margin top, 50 pixels or so. And once we jump back here and we refresh the page, we'll see that it has some margin here.
Okay, perfect.
So now this, is already looking basically like this. You'll see that all of these boxes are text aligned on top, but because we set the sizes of all the boxes, they're still the same size. It's not pushed down a little bit because we said all of these boxes would be exact squares. So I hope that gives you a little bit of flavor of how to position all of these different elements onto the page. This is not, for the record, how I would recommend you build your own web page. I would definitely say you should put much more styling onto these pages.
Of course.
Or you can go for a framework like Bootstrap, which actually does a lot of the centering, the pulling elements left and right for you as classes that you can call. And I think it's much cleaner.
Yeah.
Much cleaner than what we're doing here.
Yep.
But what I hope to show is how you can position those elements on your own, or how you can modify the positioning of elements within Bootstrap if you're using something like that, or using another CSS framework.
And I really liked how you kind of started with just sort of, hey, here's a clean slate and everything kind of a mess, and add in a couple little properties, and then, okay, now I've got this here, I've got this here, I've got this here. And that really is sort of the typical development with CSS, is you'll go in, you'll add something, let's see how it looks, go in, add something, let's see how it looks, and kind of build that iteratively, that step by step. So
yeah.
I really dig that.
Yeah, I find that if you add too many properties at the same time in CSS, you just go in, it's a mess, and then you have to open your developer tools anyway to look at which properties should not be affecting it.
Exactly. Perfect. All right, well, are you hungry?
A little bit, yeah, I'm getting there.
All right, I'm hungry. What do you say we take a meal break and we'll come on back in about an hour? Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, we'll see you guys in about an hour.
Okay. Today we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to cover how to query for different screens and different devices, as well as different screen resolutions, different aspect ratios. And we're also going to talk about, how do we change up content on the page or reflow the page based on those parameters. So that all is done in CSS, and there are, of course, ways to do, responsive web design in things that are.
There we go.
Sorry, I could tell I was being signaled for something, but wasn't quite sure what. Now I know. Yeah.
Thank you, Barry.
But yeah, so what was I saying? Oh, yeah, there are other ways to do responsive web design. The meta viewport tag, for example, is something that is used quite commonly, but we're going to cover just media queries in CSS.
Okay.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to query for basically different screens and different devices. And when we do that, I want to first cover what are some good media queries? What are some good examples of media queries? Why do we need them? So I have two examples that I wanted to show you guys. The first is a list apart. This is actually a pretty great website if you're just in general interested in web design and want to read some great literature on that. So this is basically an online web magazine on web design. And you can see right now that our screens are pretty big. Maybe you can't see that, but you can actually see a lot of content on this page, and you see that the text is quite large. But they do account for when you're scaling down the page. So you can see my window's maximized now as I am making that page smaller. You see that the image up top, this header image, is gradually changing in size as well. And it's a subtler change, but the text size is actually also going to change right when we hit this break. And you'll see that this issue number, which is, very cute, but not exactly necessary on the page, also disappears alongside this ad.
Nice.
Yeah.
And it automatically shows up down below that little the issue number 409 then slides down there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the page content is reflowed quite nicely. Everything is a bit smaller, and I know that a lot of this, such as this text down here, as well as this text up here, looks like it's being cut off. That's actually just their stylistic choice. You'll see even when we're maximized, it's intentionally hidden a little bit behind the bar.
Okay.
Nice design choice. So that's one instance of what a media query could look like. The Square website, that very famous payment processor, is also incredibly beautiful, and they do really great responsive design with media queries. So you see this is just the full page right now, and I want you guys to pay attention to a couple of things when we're resizing. One is, a couple of these things are first this contact support and log in up here, as well as actually this banner for World AIDS Day. So you'll see when I make this page smaller, things are reflowing as you might expect. But when we hit this break right here, actually these icons change to be much smaller, perhaps better touch targets if you're on a mobile device.
Yep.
And some, I guess you would say, more extraneous text is also being reflowed down here. And you'll also see when we scroll down the page that a lot of these items are now aligned in one column, whereas before they had multiple rows depending on the size up here. And these are actually similar to or perhaps same as the inline blocks that we were using before. These elements are great because they do reflow for you, so you don't need to do anything special for that. You can of course choose to size them down, size the text down, things like that, but I mean in terms of the blocks flowing down the page, they'll do that on their own, which is great.
That's cool.
Yeah, so these are, I thought, two really great examples of what really awesome media queries could look like, and ideas for what you might be able to do or want to do with a media query. But let's actually get on to how to create a query. So a query is composed of a couple of things. The first is the media type. The second are media features, and then there are also logical operators. So I know this sounds very vague. I'm going to go into examples of each one. Don't worry. I just want you to have an expectation of all the different things that are involved in a media query. So the first thing are the media types. So there are a lot out there. There are the standards that we expect, like all, meaning all screens, to print, meaning we talked about before, page that is for printing, to screen, which is computer screen, and speech, which is a speech reader. And these are the ones that are the most commonly used. But in addition to that, there are a bunch of other things. There's Braille, embossed, which is for an embossed Braille printer, basically. There's also handheld for handheld devices, projection for, that's actually, projection, yep. TVs, and then also TTY, which I never remember what it stands for, but it is the oral helper for those who are hard of hearing.
Right.
So I bolded the ones up here, the print, the screen, and the speech, because those are the ones that people most commonly work with, and probably the ones that are most relevant and the ones that are most supported by different browsers.
Right.
Yeah.
The one that's on that list that I always like to highlight because people will gravitate towards it immediately when they first see it is that handheld, because they immediately think, oh, okay, that must be what I want. The problem with handheld is that it doesn't give you a whole lot of information, that it really is designed for the older style phones, and you really don't want to use it because just because a device is handheld doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a rich device. So we want to focus in on doing those media queries rather than going for handheld.
Yeah, and so you can, instead of just querying purely for type, there are also a lot of properties that you can query for, which end up being much more helpful in determining whether or not a device is, for instance, like a touch-enabled handheld device.
Yeah.
So some of the media features that I wanted to highlight were these ones. So again, the top, the bolded ones are the ones that you'll most likely be using more of. It's the width and the height of the page. Now you're not querying for just one specific width or one specific height. You're typically doing a min width, a max width, a min height, or a max height.
Right.
Or you could alternatively use device width and device height, which the difference between the two is the width and the height is basically the width and height of the browser, which may or may not be actually the width of the device or the height of the device, right? Because for instance, I could I could scale down a browser window and I'd have a very small width and height for that browser window, but my device width and device height are still going to be large,
right?
The size of my entire screen. And you can query for things like that to know exactly what you're looking for. There's also orientation. So whether the device is landscape or whether it's in portrait view, because you might want to reflow content or maybe even like turn content depending.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen one of my favorite little examples of the orientation is that if you're in portrait mode, if you're looking at a table of content, then what'll wind up happening is you'll get maybe 2 columns, and then you flip that to landscape, and then we'll automatically add in a third or fourth, kind of a little bit more detail there. So kind of a neat little thing that you can do. And again, with CSS, no JavaScript involved. The moment that the browser detects that change, it'll apply that query and automatically show those columns or hide those columns respectively.
Yeah, and I really like doing things with CSS on mobile because a lot of mobile browsers aren't nearly feature compatible with the desktop equivalents.
Absolutely.
So these are just much more straightforward and much more reliable.
Yeah, one of my biggest peeves is opening up a site on a mobile device, and it takes 15 seconds for it to load up. Or what'll happen is maybe if it's like a news article, you scroll down, and then all of a sudden some last little bit of JavaScript fires, and then it goes back up to the top again. Yeah, the less processing that you can do, the easier things are going to be. The more that you focus in on CSS, the faster that's going to take place typically on a mobile browser.
Yeah, and there are other things that you can query for as well, feature-wise on a device. You can query to see if it's a colored device or a monochrome device. Though I really haven't seen that many monochrome devices, to be honest. You could look for resolution and et cetera, et cetera. But as I said, the top 4 are probably the ones that you're going to be most interested in. And next, I wanted to talk about some logical operators that we can use to sort of structure these queries. Because you're not going to be looking for necessarily just one thing. You're not looking for all screens or even all things of this minimum height. You might want something that's between 2 things. So one good example of this is is if you have a large screen, or if you have your site, you want it to look one way for a large, perhaps desktop mode. You want something that's slightly smaller, maybe something that's like tablet size or just like half width of a browser. And you also want something that's even smaller than that, something like a phone. And it's nice when you're in that middle spot to say, I want the max height to be this, and if the max height is this and the min height is this, so if the height is between these 2 variables, I want to display this set of CSS properties. So a lot of these are very good. And I wanted to kind of drive this point home, let's look at some example queries. So the first one we have media, min width 500 pixels. This basically just says if the page or the browser is, this should be Yeah, so if the page width is greater than 500 pixels, so 500 being the minimum, it should display these things. I didn't really put any properties in here. This is just, those are the parameters.
The important part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is just how to query, and then we'll talk later on about what are some of the considerations you should put inside of that. The next is what I just talked about. When you set a min width and a max width. So basically, if the page width is now between 700 pixels and 960 pixels, what should you do? And I guess this is a good point to say. I mostly use min width because that is overwhelmingly the best indicator of sort of someone's screen size. Because to tell you the truth, even sort of device width is sometimes finicky and not always supported. It's not always reported accurately. It's not always reported. But min width, I mean, it's the width of the browser. It's pretty, not foolproof, but it's close.
Yeah.
And if someone is resizing your page, there's still a reason for that, and you want to refill content appropriately. So that's why the min width is there. And you'll notice that I don't have sort of a media type on there. And so if you don't have a media type on there, that just applies to sort of all media types. Whereas in the third example, I have media screen and not device aspect ratio 4/3. So that says as long as this device is a screen, so mostly, self-explanatory. If it is basically a screen and the device aspect ratio is not 4:3, so if it's not sort of the old school monitor size, then apply these properties.
Right.
Whereas the bottom one is media screen and device aspect ratio 16:9 and 16:10. That's so these would just query for these two aspect ratios, and it would apply only if the aspect ratio is 16:9 or 16:10, so widescreen devices,
right.
For instance. And so, I mean, these are just some of the common queries you might consider using. I think the device aspect ratio ones are not as useful as sort of the page width ones, and in fact those are the ones that we're going to be working with, and we're actually going to add all these into the page that we created in module 3. So we're going to make our module 3 page a bit more responsive. It'll resize, the elements will resize based on your page width.
Perfect.
So one last thing is CSS importing before we get to that example. CSS importing goes hand in hand with media queries because the only parameter that you can really put in to import other CSS files are essentially media query files. So when I say import CSS, I mean within your CSS file, you can basically call out to another CSS file and include all of those components inside. It's really important to put these in the beginning of your CSS file. That's the only place that they can go. So they have to precede all other elements. And you can import them in a couple ways. You can import them using the URL sort of function tag, or you can just do the straight string for their location. And these would just be unconditional imports because there are no parameters that we specified. Whereas for the two subsequent examples, you'll see I'm importing a basic.css for basically a print media type. And so that just uses the basic CSS only if this page is, or only if the print media query is triggered. Whereas this following one, it's importing the large screen CSS files for TV or projection media types. So if it's something like a large screen, perhaps you want to change up the CSS to make fonts larger, images larger, increase contrast perhaps. That's when you'd use something like that. So I think imports are a nice way to sort of separate out your media queries from the rest of your CSS for what your standard page should be.
Because CSS can get pretty big as it is. The moment you then start putting in, you start targeting specific device sizes, then it can just get out of control. So it's a nice way to break it down, make it more manageable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So now that we have covered that, let's actually get started and create some queries on our page. So I'm going to go to, let's actually start up this page. Oh man. Open containing folder, and then I'm going to open this. And this is what we left off with. So as you can see, when we're resizing the page, some things are happening. The text is reflowing itself because it's not jumping off the page, and that's because we did the max width to be 100% of the screen instead of some fixed number. But it's not really getting smaller. This page just kind of becomes less and less usable. When we get over here, the navigation breaks down even, and it's just not very pretty. Although, one nice thing is that these inline block elements are automatically reflowing themselves in a nice way that it's centered.
All right, so we've got something going well then.
Yeah, we have one thing done, several things to go. So before we get into how to style all of these different things, let's start by talking about what are some of the different breakpoints that we want for reflowing this page. I'm going to pick. So let's go over here into our code, into style.css, and I'm just going to put these in line at the bottom here. Instead of putting these in different files, because we're not going to do too many. Oh, oops, caps lock. And I'm going to start off by doing sort of the mobile view. So I'm just going to do if the minimum screen width is under 700 pixels, that's typically something that you consider a mobile device. There are countless mobile devices out there, but generally their width, generally the width is going to be somewhere between 690 to 600, somewhere below 700 pixels, and I think that's a good breakpoint. So which media query should we use? Let's go back here and see. We have a couple of options, right? We know that these are going to definitely be screens. They're definitely going to be devices that, computer screens. So we should start with the screen. And then next, we have to pick some media features that we're going to query this on. Like I said, I'm just going to have this, a set of features appear for if the device if the width of the window is under 700. So I can use the min device, or the min width property, or the max width property, sorry, and it's going to look something very much like this, except it would be max width, obviously. So going back here, I'm going to do screen and then max width, 700 pixels, and then I'm going to put in some properties under there, and then I'm going to give this some comments that say mobile. And then we also have that sort of middle ground that we talked about. Somewhere between a phone and a desktop, there's a lot. And so I'm going to create something for that. I'd say that most desktop pages, that something's a rather large desktop when the width is generally above 960. So I'm going to do somewhere between 700 pixels and 960 as sort of another break in our page.
Okay.
So I do sort of the same thing, media, screen, and then I'll set, so I need to set both ends. So if the min width is above 700 pixels and max width is 960 pixels. And I'm going to set that. I did something bad because it's not syntax highlighting in a way that I want. Is it this? What did I do here?
Space. Screen space.
Ah, thank you.
You're welcome.
It might have worked, but it didn't look like it would work, and that's always a worrying thing. And this is going to be sort of our medium sized. That's not super descriptive, but I think it'll go a long way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave these empty for now because I want to talk about some of the considerations that you want to make in resizing your page. So that would be deciding and styling content. The first thing that we do want to do is decide on our breaking points. We've already done that done that, we want a certain look for devices that are probably handheld, something with their width being under 700. We also want something for like a medium-sized device, and then our default look will be for basically your standard issue website on a large screen, on a desktop, something like that. Some of the important considerations we need to do when we're scaling down is we want to optimize our text. Our text size right now is pretty huge. It's definitely heading sized, but as you're scaling down, the devices are smaller, the resolution is already higher, but you don't need something that's that large. So we're going to want to scale down our text size. And in the same way, we want to scale down our image size as well. We only really have one image in there, but I want to scale that down to be smaller and smaller. And actually, if it's a really small device, I don't actually need to see that CSS3 logo.
Yeah.
That is nice. It's something to, take up some space on the page, but it's not strictly necessary, right? And it's all about sort of finding out what is actually necessary to keep on the page. So let's say that's not necessarily to keep on the page. We can just hide that element at some point. And something else that's important is, adjusting your touch targets. We don't have too many touch targets in here, but something that we saw, for example, in the on the Square site is as you're scaling down, instead of having text buttons, they switched that down to sort of an easy touch target image button. And it might be nice to actually increase the touch target size on those elements as well, so that if a user is clicking very close to it, you know that they probably want to click that element, and then you'll use that as a target as well. It's just nice things to add in that you don't really need to add in for large devices.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I would actually kind of dovetail off of that with two real quick things. Number one, on the image, that keep in mind that if you hide it, that display none on CSS, the image is still sent down. And unfortunately, making an image dynamic isn't as easy as it should be. There are a couple little tricks that you could use with CSS, like a background image, or there is eventually going to be an HTML5 picture element that you can use so that you can detect the device size and choose whether or not you actually want to send the image down. But keep in mind that if you just simply say display none, it's still sent down. Now for our conversation, that's fine, but real world, it's something you might want to keep in mind. And if I can mention, again, going back to another MVA, we actually did an MVA on targeting mobile devices. And so we actually have a full conversation about things like, touch targets, implementing touch, and then also going in and showing off the different ways that you can change image size based on the device and only send down the right sized image for a phone, for a mobile device. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's something that, in fact, something we're going to talk about later, CSS preprocessors, that can help a lot as well.
Yes.
And the import statements, right? So if, for instance, if you're only importing a certain CSS style certain CSS style sheet over to the page for mobile, and you're importing another one for sort of desktop sites, then as Chris said, you can use sort of like the background image as a URL and to get specifically the image that you want. For our purposes, we're just going to do a pretty simple, hey, when the page resizes, the image gets smaller. And that's something that's just useful. And the last is to use relative sizing. So relative sizing is something that we already put into our page right from the get-go. We had just as a reminder, we had margins of sort of 10% on the left and the right. And when the page scales down, that 10% is going to get smaller and smaller. So we won't be having this like fat 100-pixel border on each side, for instance, when we're on a tiny device. So that'll actually get smaller and be sort of relative to the device size. And that's something that is incredibly useful to have. As well as what we talked about before, having those inline elements that automatically reflow themselves. So useful for if you're creating something that needs to be seen on multiple screens.
Yep.
So with that in mind, let's actually go through and add in some of these things to our media queries. So over here, let's actually start by doing our smallest screen. So the mobile/phone size. When it gets to be 700 pixels, and let me actually open this up so we can see, one nice thing about sort of developer tools is that when you put it up like this, once I get this page sort of size in a way that's not uncomfortable. Oh man.
It's so nice just usually having dual monitors here.
Yeah.
So you just toss that off to the side.
Never mind, I'm going to pin this back. But yeah, you can, you can actually see, oh, it's not happening on this computer for some reason. But you can usually see, there's a way to get this to happen. I can't do it quite right now. To actually see the width of the page, right now. Do you know how to get that showing? I thought that was automatic.
The width of the...
Yeah, usually it shows up. Or let me try this. Yeah, it's not showing up right now. On my other computer, it showed up sort of as a, hey, this is 700 pixels right now type thing. But that's okay. Roughly when we know that, a page is this small, we don't want an image there. We don't need an image there. That's not necessary, right?
Right.
So we can just completely hide that image, and we'll just use a selector for it. It is this CSS image ID tag that we used up here. So I'll just do CSS image, and I'll do a simple display none to hide it. And you know what? We actually probably also don't need this side text. We can just, have our title and that be it. So we can also just hide our side text in the same way.
One thing that's worth highlighting as Helen is putting in the CSS is you're going to notice that all that she's doing is taking advantage of that inheritance. Because when she goes in and she sets up that media, that's now going to more explicitly define those elements. And so that's now what's going to take precedence. So rather than going in and having to redo everything, she's just going in and targeting the couple of properties that are necessary for that device size, modifying those, making those what it needs to be, and that's it. So you're not going back and redoing a brand new CSS file from scratch.
Exactly. And that's also the nice thing about including it in here, is you can see those differences. Exactly. So okay, so I have those two things. But one thing that actually also bothered me is that when the screen gets to be this size, these don't sit very nicely. And to be honest, I mean, the link to the MBA course is much more important than either of our Twitter handles.
Hey.
I'm sorry. I know.
I have like 2 followers on Twitter, and one of them is my mother, and I don't really think that counts.
I'm the other one, right?
Yes, and Barry's the other one.
I'll follow you on Twitter if you let me just hide both of us.
All right.
Okay.
Fair deal.
Yeah. So as you can see, a lot of what I'm doing right now is basically just hiding stuff. Because once you're on a smaller screen, you need to really know what is important on the page, what you need to show, and what you can sort of get away with hiding. So we're going to hide our names, and we don't really have, actually, if you look at the code for this, we don't really have specific classes for our Twitter handles versus this. It's kind of the same thing, or it's the same type of attribute. But what we can do is we can use the pseudo classes, as we talked about before, to just hide the two of our handles. So what I'm going to do is sort of the same selector as I did before, header, and then list item descendants of that. And then I'm going to do the not, which I think was briefly brought up. These are just basically, if it's not whatever is in here, then it'll be true, right?
Okay.
It just negates it. So I'm going to hide everything that's not the first child.
Okay.
Because if you look on the page, the first thing on the list is the link to the site, and then everything else is just our handle. So I'm going to do not the first child, and then I'll say display none for that as well. Don't worry, I'll do other things besides display none. I know, right now it's kind of just the same thing over and over. But yeah, I'm just going to hide everything that's not the first item of that list.
Yeah, but that display none is very important, especially when you get into that print. So doing things like just hiding all of those images, hiding the navigation, all of that's very important.
Yeah, exactly. And one last thing I'm going to do is this text is huge. I don't think I should hide it up there, but this is basically 3 times the normal size. It's 3 EM originally, and I'm going to make it something manageable, like 1 EM, like the size of general text on the page, especially since, it's a smaller screen. And how did I define that? I think I did. I'm going to check to make sure. Banner text is just an ID. Perfect. So I'm going to do banner text, and I'm going to set that. I'm going to set the font size to just be 1 EM. And then now when I save this and I refresh this little guy. Oh, did I save it? Maybe I'm not on the right page. That's embarrassing. Demo.html. This is style.css.
Just do a real quick Control F5. Sorry, inside of Visual Studio. Because what that should do is then reopen up the browser for you.
All right. Well, let's. I'm going to think about what could be going wrong right now. Media screen max width 700 pixels. That should be fine. Yeah, display none is a pretty straightforward property. If it's showing up, it should show up.
Go back to the browser again. And yeah, just and do a Control F5 on it just to make sure. Because I'm wondering if maybe something is cached, and then shrink that down.
Interesting. Okay. I'm going to check something. I'm going to check what it's supposed to be to see if I did anything wrong. I did. That's embarrassing. I think I forgot this and here. And maybe that'll fix it. Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Okay.
I forgot the and.
That's the demo blow up graphic.
It's not the worst thing. That's why you have the backup knowledge.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so now that you're on a smaller screen, the text is much smaller. But that's a pretty drastic jump that we did to go from this page to this with basically no transition in between. So what I'm going to do is actually flash out this part, and then I'm going to do this and right here. That way that doesn't blow up. And I'm going to add the properties here that we talked about. I'm going to just be lazy, copy a lot of these things over, because these are the elements that I still want to change. Maybe not these. I think our names will stay up there for something of this size. We're that important, right? So it's all about progressively removing elements, and we're not there yet. We don't need to remove ourselves yet. Okay. Yeah, yet. So for the CSS image, instead of just doing display none, I'm actually just going to shrink it down a little bit. I'm going to change its width and height. And so before it was, I think, 300. Now I'm going to do maybe 150, something half the size of its original. And for the side text, let's see what I had before. For side text, I had font size 1.5 EM before, and maybe now I'll just do 1 EM. And then for banner text, instead, I don't want it the same size as my font, so I'm going to actually up that back up to 2 EM, so it's twice as big, and that still looks like a header text. And I'm going to save this, and then when I go over here and I refresh, I'm going to drag this out too. Okay, so this is between the 700 pixels and the 960. It'll look like this. As you can see, this logo is quite a bit smaller than this original, and so are both of the texts. They're both significantly smaller. So now when you're going from a page of this size to a page of this size, you get something that's smaller, and then when you go even smaller, and smaller, you have that sort of aggressive degradation of the page.
That looks really slick. I like it.
Yeah, there are sort of two schools of thought about doing these things, and the one that I just did is, start with a fully fleshed page, decide what to take out as you go smaller and smaller. But of course, a lot of people also just choose to do the opposite. They look before they build a page, or as they're building the page, they say, "Hey, what are some of the most important elements on that page?" And they sort of build for that, that small mobile screen first.
Yep.
And then they sort of say, well, what else can I add? What other information can I add until they get to a larger and larger screen?
Right.
And that's also great as well. I think one good example of this that I saw was a weather app. When you're on the smallest screen, you want to basically just show, hey, what is the temperature outside? What is the weather like? And then as the screen gets bigger, you can say, this is the humidity outside, this is the chance precipitation.
There you go.
And things like that. And then as you go full on page, and you add like a background image. And I think that's also a really great way of thinking about designing your site as well. It depends on the type of site that you're building. If you're building something that's pretty full content, you maybe want to start big, go small. If you're building something that's more like a small lightweight web app, you can start small, go big.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts you have on media queries?
No, the only couple of things have really just been around images in the chat window. And again, images is just one of those really tricky things. The one little tool that I'm going to highlight here, and actually let me bring up. I want. I think it's all one word. Processing. That's my little dance. There we go. Okay. Perfect. So Scott, and I'm going to mispronounce his last name. Jail?
That sounds okay to me.
Okay.
I'm not Scott, though.
Scott J has this great little tool called Picture Fill. And what this will do is it will, regardless of your browser, bring to life the picture element. And what's great about the picture element is it will allow you to identify different picture files based on those exact same media queries that Helen just showed off there. And what's important about that is because somebody asked about resizing the image, and in the case of your CSS logo, resizing that makes sense. But resizing a lot of other pictures, just simply shrinking it down, isn't really what we want. That a lot of times what we want to do is focus in on different areas. So just kind of get rid of some more of the surrounding area. So we need different files. That's where that picture element comes into play. This is eventually supposed to become part of HTML, but as anybody who's experienced with HTML can tell you, just because it's supposed to be coming doesn't mean that it's coming anytime soon or will actually happen. So this will, through JavaScript, automatically implement that for you, and it's a really slick little utility. So definitely recommend checking that out. So, and then beyond that, I think that's about it as far as the Q&A goes.
Okay, great.
So, yeah. So what do you say we take 10 minutes, and then we'll come on back, and we'll actually do two things. I'm actually going to do a real quick aside and show off columns, just because we haven't done columns yet. And I'm sort of feeling a little bad because all of your stuff has been looking really, really good, and my little demo kind of looked a little bit cheesy. So I want to go in and kind of finish that out, throw in some columns, which is typically how you'd want something that's that much text to display. And then I'll also show off how to implement transitions and resize things as well through CSS. But let's take 10, and then we'll come on back and we'll do all that. So we'll see you guys back here in 10. So welcome back. This is adding style with CSS, and alongside Helen Zhang, I am Christopher Harrison. Now, for those of you who are just tuning in, Helen actually has just gone through a series of amazing demos and put together a pretty good looking site. And I'm now feeling a little inferior. Like, the pages that I've done up until now have been, really just kind of proof of concept ones. So I at least want to go in and try to gussy things up a little bit and kind of make things look a little bit more real world. And in particular, what I want to do for right now, I'm going to kind of sidestep the module, although we are going to get into transitions, transformations. Those are really important. And I actually want to focus in on one last little feature that we haven't yet discussed, and talk about how we can get kind of a very typical style setup for our site. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the little site that I had before, and I still have that width of 75%. I'm going to go back in and fix that here momentarily. But what I did earlier this morning was I set up our little nav section here with our cool little mouse over, and I did all of that, and then I had the article here, and it was relatively long, and for this demo I've now shrunk that down. And here's what I'd like to do, and I think this is pretty standard, pretty stock, is I would like over here on the left side to have our navigation. And then over here on the right side, what I would like is I would like columns. So that way some of our text appears over here and some of our text appears over there. Wouldn't that be nice? Please say yes so I can do my demo.
Yes, and it's very newspaper-like. I mean, when people are reading, or actually when I'm reading, I don't like to read across the entire thing.
Yeah, just down and then down the other side. Absolutely, yeah.
Although when I said that, I felt like I was saying I only read half of sentences because I only read to the middle.
You're trying to figure out.
I just don't like to read the entire line,
Exactly, exactly. All right, so let's start off by creating this side over here. And one of the things that Helen showed off was that cool little float capability. So what I'm going to do is take advantage of that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say nav, and we'll put it in lowercase letters. And I'm actually surprised nobody's asked this, if CSS is case sensitive or not. We almost always get asked that whenever we're doing some form of a language MVA. And the way that I always answer that is treat everything like it's case sensitive. It just makes life a lot easier in the long run. Standard for CSS is to go all lowercase though, just like with HTML5. Okay, in the meantime, so now I'm going to say nav and I'm going to say float, which is spelled like that, float left. Because again, we want it on the left side. And I come back over here, I hit refresh, and you're going to notice that my navigation section is on the left side. That part's good, but everything else is flowing around it, which is the original design of float, and that's not what I want. That I want this to take over that entire left side. This is where that display of inline block comes into play. So now what I can do is I can say display : inline block. There we go. Let's hit save. Let's come back over here. Let's hit refresh. Nothing happens because I also need to do it to the text as well to get that straight line. So now let's come back over here and I'm going to say article, and there's my curly braces, and I'm going to say display and inline block. Okay. And now let me come back over here, hit refresh, and now we've got that neat little dividing line. I'd like to kind of push everything over here just a little bit. So I'm just going to extend the margin left, and let's set that to, one rem. There we go. And now let's come back over here. Left, right. There we go. So you remember back to grade school. Of course, I can't do the L on the other hand, but when you're learning letters or learning left and right, see L, see it forms an L. So left, right, and yeah. Anyway, so coming back over here, now you're going to notice that that everything is the way that I want it, and I've got my my little links over here on the left side. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to divide this up with columns, but I've got a bit of a problem here because I could go in to this article and I could say, all right, well, that looks like it's about half of the text, and that looks like it's about half of the text, and I could go in and set up a brand new section and just put them next to each other using the exact same format that I used a second ago. That would work, but it's not going to work real well when the text changes. Now, what happens if maybe, and let's just come back over here, I go in and I do something like this, that maybe my text magically doubles in size because somebody goes in and copies and pastes. And now I come back over here and I hit refresh, and now you're going to notice that's much bigger. So again, I'm going to have that bit of a problem of how do I create those two columns? And this has been something that we've been wanting for decades now when it comes to HTML, the ability just to say, hey, I want that split up into two columns. Are you ready?
Yeah.
We can now do this with CSS. I'm going to come back to my article, and I'm now going to say column. Now you'll notice first of all that I've got column count. So all I'm going to do is just column count, and you'll notice again, let me zoom in on that. There we go. You'll notice that little pair of scissors that's indicating a snippet to me. So what I'm going to do with that highlighted, column, there we go, is I'm just going to go in and say tab, tab.
Nice.
And so that will automatically give me the vendor specific. And I wanted two columns, so I'm just going to say 2, and I'm just going to hit the down arrow. And poof, everything is now set to 2. So I just come back over here, I hit save, I come back over here, I hit refresh, and now you're going to notice that everything is flowing into 2 columns. Cool.
And you know all the shortcuts. That's impressive. I'm learning so much about Visual Studio from you.
Oh, thank you. I'm a big, big believer in shortcut keys. By the way, where's my VW from before? There it is. I want to go in and get rid of that. Okay. There we go. Okay. And you're also going to notice that there is a lot of other column options as well about whether or not you want to span columns. There's also different rules that you could go in and apply. You can specify the widths. You can put a gap between them and so forth. So you can really go in and kind of get full control over those columns, how the text is going to flow through all of that and so forth. Whoa. Let me just, article, and I want width, and I'm going to say 100 VW. Okay. Why did you work 2 seconds ago, and now all of a sudden you're not working? You're wonderful. Okay, yeah, there we go. There's my little demo. You know, for right now, I'm sure it's one of those little things of I'm sure I'm applying something not quite right. So I'm just going to put it back to that 75% since it was happy with that, and we'll just kind of leave it there. I figured that'll be good for the moment. Yeah.
I mean, it looks fine.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, now, if you remember all the way back to this morning, I know that was a while ago. But if you remember all the way back, one of the big things that we talked about was wanting this separation of concern. So the HTML is designed to say, hey, this is what our text is. So you'll notice, for example, that I've been using that article and I've been using that section. And what's very interesting about article and section is what they don't do. They don't do anything. That the only thing that they do is simply contain text. And then it's up to you to add the style in on your own using CSS. So we want to use CSS for all of our style. That's what CSS is there for. On top of that, one very big thing that we've sort of highlighted a bit of is performance. That up until now, we haven't done a single bit of JavaScript. And bad JavaScript is really what's going to slow your sites down. And so here, very simple little rule here. The fastest JavaScript code is the code you don't write. If you can do it, Deep Thoughts by Christopher Harrison. If you can do it without JavaScript, do it without JavaScript. Okay, well then let's talk about a couple of different things that we might typically do with JavaScript. And one of them is transformations. That let's say, going back to the article that we had a couple seconds ago, that I wanted to change the color of those little links. Or maybe I wanted to put in a little bit of a background on them. But if I put my mouse over it, it's just automatically going to throw that color onto there. It'd be nice to have a little fade effect. And then when I pull my mouse away, have a little fade effect and have that go away again. Wouldn't that be nice?
That sounds beautiful.
It sounds
a little
fantastic.
fade in, fade out.
Yeah. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, that's going to be dynamic, right? So that must mean JavaScript. Ah, so you were talking about style. So we can do this with CSS. The other very big thing that you might be looking to do is to resize things. So one of the big things that Helen was showing off before with the media queries was going in and resizing different elements or hiding different elements. What happens if we want to be able to just globally resize something, just make it bigger, make it smaller? Well, fortunately, we can do that as well with our transformations, and that's actually where we're going to start. That our transformations allow us to take items and manipulate them. So if you want to rotate them, if you want to skew them, if you want to resize them, you can do this all through CSS. Now, because of the fact that this is done with CSS, this can be done with any class, with any element, and with any media query. So if all that you need to do is just simply take a particular div block and resize that down, you can do that without having to go into all the different fonts and all the different sizes and calculate everything. You can just simply say, be smaller, and it will be smaller for you. Now, what are some of the different things that we can do? Well, the first thing that we can do is translate. Remember how we've been talking in the past about how it's not always intuitive, some of the names. Translate does mean move.
Yeah.
At least to me, that doesn't scream move.
Yeah. I think once you're out of geometry class for more than a year or so, you forget the whole translate thing, unless you deal with CSS on a regular basis.
Yep. Yeah, we forgot to warn everybody, there's going to be math today. We're going to bring everybody back to geometry class. So anyway, so what translate's going to do is it's going to move an element from one location to another. So if we go back to my slide, I spent hours working on this animation, Barry. I want to make sure that I show this off. Are you ready? Here we go. Ooh. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Nicely translated.
Nice. Yeah, so it actually, moved it to somewhere else on the page. Now, I did the animation mostly just because I wanted to show examples in the slide of each one of these, because I'm not going to demo each one of these. I threw the animations in. I do want to stress, however, it doesn't work like this out of the box. So, sort of like, you're watching some commercial for some toy and it shows it doing something in the little disclaimer down at the very bottom. Toy doesn't actually dance or sing. It doesn't automatically move, but we can, do that. So keep in mind that when you set one of these transformations, it's going to apply to that element right then and there. If you want it to transition, we can do that, but that's going to require a transition, and we'll get to that in a little while here. Scale is going to resize. So you'll notice here my scale, and ooh, it's going to get bigger. See, there we go. Again, these animations spend hours. Rotate. It's going to rotate the element. There we go. And then skew is going to, and I couldn't make this happen very easily, so there it is. It's going to skew it. So you'll notice that my little borders here are off to the side. So those are all the different transformations that you can do. And then you can also do none. And there's my animation for none. That did take the longest. The reason that none exists is it gives you the ability just to disable everything. That one of the things that can happen sometimes with CSS, especially when you start playing around with things like media queries, is something might happen on one media query and then it doesn't automatically get reset later on. So by my going in and saying transformation none, that will turn off all transformations. So if something else had said something, maybe that property was still applying for one reason or another, this allows me just to turn that right off. Okay. So now let's go in and do all of those different translations. Okay, so there's my little page here, and all I want to do is just resize something. And actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it a little bit simpler on myself. I'm just going to say add, and I'm going to say HTML page, and this is going to be my resize demo. And let's just go in and add in a real quick div, and let's give this an ID of resize me, and let's go in and say style, and let's go in and say pound resize me, and I'm going to go in and say height, and let's say 100 pixels, and then let's say width, and let's say 100 pixels. And now I want to resize that. So what I'm going to do is just simply say transform, and you are going to notice that every single browser has it implemented, and there's vendor-specific tags for every single one of them. A lot of browsers, I would even venture to say most browsers, do now support just simply transform, and that is, oh, that's kind of cool. And that is what I'm going to use here because it will work. Keep in mind, however, that if you just use transform, older browsers may complain. So just kind of keep that in mind. But now what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to hit my colon, and you'll notice that there's all of the different transformations that I can set up here. And you're going to notice on here that there are a few that I didn't actually get in and mention, in particular in the land of 3D. So if you actually want to flip things in a third dimension, you can do that. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about images, you know, and kind of dealing with images. One very big thing that you can do is use SVG graphics, the scalable vector. And so you can actually just go in and declaratively say, hey, this is how I want things. And so by using these little transformations, you can draw the flat surface and then flip that and move that backwards and forwards and so forth, all on that third dimensional plane. So you can really get pretty advanced with the different transformations that are available to you. In my case, though, I'm going to go ahead and say translate, and that's going to give me the ability to move this from the left and from the top. So I'm going to say 200 pixels and 200 pixels, and then I'm going to add in a resize, scale rather. There we go. And let's go ahead and scale this. Now the scale is going to be a number-based percentage. So if you want to double it in size, that means you're going to use the number 2 to scale that. And you can actually scale on both the X and the Y axis. And let me actually move this kind of a little bit more center here. So I'm just going to say 400 and 400. There we go. Okay, so let's go in and fire this up. Oh, it would help if I set a background color on that. Otherwise, we're just going to wind up with a white box and a white background. Background, color, and blue. There we go. And
okay.
There we go. All right. No comma. That was where my mistake was. So now what you're going to notice is that it has been moved down, moved over, and you're going to notice that it's been resized. Cool. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. A lot of you are probably thinking, okay, that's fine and all, but I don't get it. Why in the world am I going to want to just hard code this into a style and just have it be resized? Well, the first big reason is if you were using media queries. So that way, if I do need to resize something for a media query, that allows me to very easily do that. In fact, here, let's just kind of do this real quick here, is I'm going to add in my media, and I'm going to say min width colon 500 pixels. There we go. And then let's go in and set that up inside of resize me. So resize me. Boom. And boop, and boop, boop. All right. Now, there is my little resize for my min width. So as a result, when it's small, you'll notice small, and then when we get up to big, now you're going to notice that it's bigger. So that's the first big reason why you might decide to use that. The second reason that you might decide to go in and use those little translates is this can oftentimes be an easier way to resize things than trying to do everything with JavaScript. So what I can do is combine this with a bit of JavaScript and then just simply set that style property and add in the transform that way. And I'm actually going to get to that at the very end. I know we haven't done any JavaScript, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least show off a little bit of JavaScript, in particular with jQuery, because so often when you're talking about different jQuery extensions, the way that they're making their magic happen is just by adding and removing classes. So it'd be nice to show off kind of how that's done and do that with a little bit of resizing. So we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Okay. Now, that's how we can go in and resize something and move something. How about making something happen over time? You know, so when I go in and I mouse over something, rather than it just instantly resizing or instantly changing the background color, how about a little bit of easing into it and a little bit of easing out? And you know, it's funny, and I really should go track down this study again. I read this years ago, that what they did was they took the exact same application. So it did the exact same thing, and it had the exact same bugs. But they changed the UI on one of them. So one of them was a very simplistic UI, and then the other one was a very nice, rich UI. And then they gave them to different users, and they asked them to kind of report their overall feelings and bugs and so forth. And what they found was people reported a lot more bugs on the lesser UI than they did on the fancier UI. Because if you see a fancier UI, you're going to look at that and you're going to go, oh, okay, well, they've obviously spent a lot of time with this. So, you know, that little bug that just came up, that must be me. I must have done something wrong there. And I know it sounds sort of silly, but it's true that, you know, perception is reality. How your users perceive your site, perceive your application is a very important component to the success of it. So those little touches do go a long way, and CSS makes it so easy to add all of those in, and it's going to be done by utilizing transitions. So let's talk about how to add in a transition. Well, what you're going to notice is that if I want to transition, if I want to add on that bit of animation, all that I really need to do is just simply say, hey, I want to add a transition to that property, and I want it to take that long. That's it. So I can still go in and set the exact same key value property. So I can still say background color : yellow, or I can still say size : and then whatever it is. So I can still go in and do all of that just like I would with normal CSS. And then I just come down here and I say, all right, well, I want to apply that transition to that size property, or to that color property, or whatever else it is that it might be. And then on the duration, this is just simply how long I want it to take. That's really it. Now, the delay allows you to just incorporate a little bit of a delay. Just hold off before you go in and make that little change. And then finally, last but not least, is the timing function. And that's going to impact how it's going to kind of start, go in the middle, and then finish. So if I choose linear, it's going to go that same speed throughout. If I go ease, it's going to go slow to start, faster in the middle, and then slow to end. And then if I go ease out or ease in, it's going to just go slower at the end or at the beginning, respectively. Now, those are the four options that you're typically going to go for. If you're really feeling like you want a lot more control, you can actually go in and explicitly code how you want things to take place. Again, I've got better things to do with my time. Maybe that is something that you want to go in and do. I generally find that the built-in options actually work just fine for me. Okay, so with that, let's go in and take a look at how we could take advantage of that. And so let's come back to our article here. And on the hover, let's go in and set my background color. And I'm going to set this to be yellow. I'm going to start with yellow and just kind of see how I like it. There we go. All right. Yeah, yellow will work. Okay. And I am going to make this a little bit bigger. Zoom, 150. There we go. Okay. So I like my little yellow. But you'll notice that the moment I put my mouse over it, it's just boom, now it's yellow and that's it. So I would like a little bit of an ease into that. So here's all I have to do. This is it. No JavaScript required. Is I just sneak down here and I just simply say transition. Now again, you are going to notice it's a code snippet, and you are going to notice again when I go tab that it's going to add in for every single browser there. So I've got all of those really with the exception of Internet Explorer. I'm going to make my life easier, and I'm just going to go with transition, which again will work on most browsers, but if you are wanting full support, you should go with the with all the rest of them. I don't think we need to see the same property 5 times though. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back in, and I'm going to say transition, and I'm going to say transition property. Let's start here, and I'm just going to say color, or background color. There we go. Perfect. So now I'm saying I want to transition on background color. So the underline will still appear right away. My background color is the one that's now going to have the animation applied to it. If I also want an underline, then I could also go in and say underline as well. In my case, though, I just want background color. All right. And now let's go in and say transition duration. And let's say, I don't know, about 200 milliseconds. That'll probably work.
Yeah, that's a little fast, but I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
You like 500?
That sounds good. Half a second. I could see that. I have really slow reaction time, so I like the longer delays.
Okay, perfect. And let's also add in a little bit of a transition delay. And I'm just going to set that to be 10 milliseconds. And really, all that I'm looking to do there, it's so funny, my brain is just hard-coded. I'm in CSS, I typed in a number, it must be pixels. Yes. So in any event, what that's really there for is that way if somebody's just simply moving their mouse around, that it's not always going to do that. Because if somebody's just going like this, there's no reason for me to get all fancy with the animations there.
Oh, you don't want it to create a nice little rainbow?
I suppose you could. All right, so we'll add that in, and then last but not least is going to be our timing function, and let's just go in with an ease in. There we go. Cool. So now I hit save. I come back over here. I hit refresh. Ooh.
Do it again. Yeah. Good transition.
Yeah. Now, I am going to make this obnoxiously long here. I'm going to make this 5 seconds. And the reason that I want to do that is just because it's going to work a little bit better for demo purposes. And you'll notice that slowly but surely, it is in fact coming into yellow. All right. I would probably not recommend going 5 seconds there. Now, here's the problem that I have, is you're going to notice that if I just pull the mouse away, it goes right back to a white background again. And if you're anything like me, and I know I am, that sort of leaves a little bit of a hollow feeling there because we had this really nice animation coming in. It'd be nice if we had that animation going back out again. This is the only slightly bad part, I guess, is you are going to notice I'm just going to need to take this, copy, and then just paste that back into there. So let's just go in, let's paste that back in, and you know, on the transition out, we should probably go the other direction, which is to say that we should probably go slower on the out. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to say out. So now I'm going to save that, and I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to hit refresh. And now what you're going to notice is I put my mouse back over, it's slowly going to go into yellow, and then I pull the mouse away, and you're going to notice that it's going to slowly go back to white. And what I really love about this is if I do this, so I put my mouse over, it's coming yellow, 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 and I pull my mouse away, so it didn't get to full yellow, you'll notice that it just picks up right where it was, and then starts going back down again. Cool.
Very cool.
Now, I copied and pasted. Pop quiz. Forgot to warn you there was going to be a pop quiz. CSS stands for what again?
Cascading style sheets.
Cascading style sheets. So these properties cascade. So it's right there in the name, cascade. So an anchor tag is also an anchor hover tag, right?
Yes.
Cool. So that would mean that if I took away that, and that should inherit from up here, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's go ahead, let's hit save, let's come back over here, hit refresh, and now you're going to notice, sure enough, it's coming in, and you'll notice that when I take my mouse away, it's also going out. Because the only thing that was different about how I wanted to do that fade in and fade out was just simply what I wanted to have happen at the end and at the beginning for my regular and for my hover respectively. So I just changed that one property and I let the other ones inherit. So at the end of the day, this is still just CSS.
That's great. There's a question, and I think it's a pretty good one. What happens, or can you set different transitions for the same element, like different transition properties?
Absolutely. Yeah, so what you could also do is, let's say that I also went with, I'm trying to think of something else.
I think the underline was a good one.
Yeah, okay, so let's go with text decoration. There we go. So you'll notice that I could actually add in text decoration as well. So let me go in, save that. Let's go ahead, hit refresh. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't get a transition on underline. What do I want to do?
Text color or font color?
Yeah, there we go. Sure, we'll just go with color. So let's come down here, color, colon, and let's go with black. And there we go. Let's go with black, color. Cool. Okay, that'll work. Now, let's come back over here. Let me hit refresh. And now what you're going to notice is that, again, over that 5 seconds, it's now going to fade from blue to black, and then you'll notice back again. So you can add in multiple. What I would also say is you can set different values for the duration, for the delay, and for the timing function as well. So if I want the color to maybe be a bit faster, so let's say that I want that to be maybe at 200 milliseconds. So I want that to be real fast. And I'm going to do this with red, just because I think that's going to pop a little bit better here. Then I could go in and set my 2 different sizes. So that 500 milliseconds is going to be for the background color. That 200 milliseconds is going to be for the foreground color or color. Let me go in, hit refresh, and now you're going to notice that it's basically instant. Whoa, no, it's not applying my animation.
There.
Well, no, it's not giving me the different values. Why are you not giving me the different values? I might need a vendor tag on that, because it is possible. It is possible for me to go in and set those different speeds. It might just be that I need a different vendor tag. Yeah, because it's just ignoring it if I do it that way. But in any event, you can go in and apply that to multiple properties, which was really the question there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's kind of keep on keeping on here. And let me bring up another little example that I was kind of building in the background here. Kind of a simple little form. So please register. And there's our little name, our little email, and then our little submit button down at the very bottom. And that's right now a div tag. I want that to be like a button.
Yes.
So I want to not make the text selectable. I also want to make it so that when you click on it, that it will resize. So maybe kind of condense down just a little bit like you've actually clicked on it. Wouldn't that be cool?
That would be nifty.
That would be nifty. Fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off by getting rid of the text selection capabilities. So if I, inside of my demo button, just type in the word select, you'll notice that there is a user select here. So I can say user select, and then inside of here, I can say none. Come back over here, hit refresh, and now what you're going to notice is I need my browser specific user select. There we go, and I want none. There we go. Okay, hit refresh. And now you'll notice I'm trying to select, and I can't. That was cool.
Yeah.
Very easy. Now, the other thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to get rid of that little bar cursor there, and I'd like to change the cursor to be, maybe the crosshair, because it's a button, so you're, focused in on it. It's going to be a crosshair. That's what I'm going to go with. All right. In any event, let's come back over here, hit refresh, and now what you're going to notice is I get that neat little crosshair, so I can go in and try to click on that. Now, you'll notice I was able to do all of that with CSS. And again, moral of the entire day is if we can do it with CSS, let's do it with CSS. CSS, unfortunately, doesn't have things like mouse down or mouse up states. So I'm going to need a little bit of JavaScript. But one of the great things about JavaScript, and in particular I want to focus in on jQuery, because jQuery makes this very easy, is the ability for me to add and remove classes. And the vast majority of all the different animations and so forth that you see are all based on the addition and removal of classes. That's really it. So let's just create a class, and let's just call it shrink. And let's just go in and say transform. And I'm going to say, in my case, scale. And let's say 0.5 and 0.5. And I'm making that kind of really small there, but
yeah.
I'm just trying to, prove the point. And then let's go in and say dot grow, and let's go in and say transform, and let's say none. So we'll just get rid of the transformation. And now what I want to do is I just want to, for right now, on my little button, let's start it out with class equals, I'm going to call it default, just because I think that's a better name in the long run, rather than grow, because I'm just setting it back to the default, don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Setting it to grow would make me think that it's growing.
Yeah, it's going to get bigger, not that it's just going back to the original size. Okay, so now let's sneak down here and let's add in a little bit of jQuery here. There we go. And for those of you not familiar with jQuery, we actually, again, have an MVA on jQuery. But what jQuery does is it makes it easier through JavaScript to do all of those different things that we sort of take for granted in typical development. So adding on things like click event handlers and so forth is very easy to do in Windows development, but it's not always as easy as one would hope in JavaScript. So jQuery makes it easier to do things like that. It also does a lot more, but I think that's the easiest way to describe it.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is to simply say script. I'm going to use the shortcut for onload. So once the document loads, it's going to run this function, and I'm going to go find my demo button. Why did I camel case that? And then I'm going to say, let's say mouse down. And then on mouse down, I'm going to add in a brand new function. And on that function, I'm just going to grab the button by doing this, dot, and then we'll just simply say toggle class. And let's go in and say default and toggle class. And then let's say shrink. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I honestly would do it that way normally, but I want to kind of make it a little bit more explicit, just kind of call it out here. So let's say remove class default. There we go. And then let's say $this, and let's say add class and shrink. There we go. And then let's also just do the opposite.
I think you might need the ID selector for demo button.
Ah, thank you. I always do that.
Yeah.
That is the #1 mistake that I wind up making inside of jQuery. And then I want mouse up. There we go. Okay. And cool. There we go. So I'm just swapping those classes. Okay. So now let's go in and hit save. Let's come back over here, hit refresh, and you're going to notice mouse down, it shrinks. Mouse up, it comes back.
Very nice.
It is. Wouldn't it be nice if it eased into that and eased back out?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, fortunately, again, CSS, the C stands for
Cascading.
So I can set that property here on the button itself. So regardless of where it's going to get the transition properties applied, it will always work. So I'm just simply going to say transition duration, and let's go in and say maybe 500 milliseconds. Let's say transition property, and that's going to be transform. Now, transform is just like any other CSS property. So I can use it in media queries, I can use it in classes, I can use it in IDs. Can I use it with transition properties? Yes, because it's just a CSS property. Cool. And then I could also set my transition timing function, and then let's just go with an ease, which is going to ease in and ease out both. Okay, so now let's come back over here, let's hit refresh, and now what you're going to notice, ooh, and then release. Ooh.
Very nice.
Yeah, so just like that, I was able to build all of that, and I really should add in a mouse out as well, so that way if somebody does that and then pulls their mouse away, it will come back out, but that's okay. You start to see where all of this is going. And what I want to highlight about all of this is the fact that you might look at this and you might think, well, wait a minute. I'm going to add in some interactivity based on a click, based on a mouse down and a mouse up. And so you might be thinking, okay, that should then be in JavaScript, because after all, that's typically where things like this go, right? It goes in JavaScript. Well, here's the thing. What are we trying to do? What's the actual end goal? Well, the end goal, the effect that that mouse down and mouse up is going to have is going to be on the display. It's going to be on the style. And what should be in charge of style?
The style sheets, the CSS.
There you go, the style sheet, the CSS. So you'll notice that we built everything else into CSS. So how big should it be? How small should it be? All of that was built inside of CSS. And where that also becomes very important is when we start talking about things like, once again, media queries and different types of devices. So I might decide for a desktop that that type of a shrink behavior is exactly what I want, but I might decide for a mobile device that maybe that's not what I want. So maybe what I do, and I'm not going to go in and do the full thing here, I just want you to kind of see the point that maybe what I do is I say media, and I say max width, and let's say, oh, I don't know, 500 pixels, whatever. So let's go in and say that I did that. I really should get a colon into there. There we go. So let's say I go in and I do 500 pixels, then what I could do is I could say dot shrink, dot default, and then just completely turn off any transformations. And I can do that right there inside the style sheet. No logic required inside of JavaScript. And that again goes back to separation of concern. Let CSS worry about how things are going to be displayed. Let JavaScript worry about things like logic and wiring up the event handlers. So now, one little bit right there, no JavaScript required. This is now automatically going to disable that little animation on any smaller device. So very simple for me to go in and add that in.
That's great. Yeah, very useful.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. All right, in the event. So here's what we saw in that module. What we saw in that module is, once again, how we can take CSS and really kick things up. And CSS is all about handling the display. This is what we want to use. So hopefully the biggest thing that you got out of this was not a desire to go running for JavaScript every time that you want to add in something cool. Let the CSS handle the display for you. Let the HTML handle the semantic structure, and let JavaScript do your business logic. All right. What do you say we take 10 minutes, come back, and not talk about CSS? I mean, we'll talk about CSS, but let's talk about preprocessors and how hopefully we can try to clean up our CSS a bit, because obviously it can get very big.
Yeah.
All right. So let's take 10, and we'll see you guys back here then.